The crack of a rifle split the frozen desert air as Clara Whitmore stumbled through thorns, her wedding dress painting crimson trails across Arizona sand. Behind her, Victor Hale's dogs howled for blood, her blood. The woman he'd bought like cattle had dared to run. Tonight she'd rather die free than live as property. When her bleeding feet found Jonah Carver's porch, she whispered through cracked lips, "Please, I'm not clean anymore." Welcome to a tale of vengeance and redemption in the Old West. Stay with me until the end, and comment your city below. I'd love to know how far this story travels. The lamp in Jonah Carver's window flickered against the darkness, like a dying star casting long shadows across the weathered floorboards of his cabin. He sat alone at a rough-hewn table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey, his only companion on this bitter January night. The wind outside howled through the canyon, rattling the shutters with ghostly fingers, but Jonah barely noticed. He'd grown accustomed to the sound of emptiness. 10 years had passed since Shiloh. 10 years since he'd watched his younger brother Samuel die in his arms, choking on blood and Confederate grape shot. 10 years of trying to forget the smell of burning flesh at Willow Creek, where 37 civilians, women and children among them, had been herded into a church and burned alive by Confederate raiders. The man who'd given that order still walked free, had even prospered in the aftermath of war. Victor Hale. The name tasted like ash in Jonah's mouth every time he thought it. He poured another measure of whiskey, watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight. His hands, once steady enough to drop a man at 300 yards, now trembled slightly. Not from age, he was only 38, but from the weight of memories that refused to stay buried. The cabin around him stood as testament to his self-imposed exile, sparse, functional, devoid of any softness that might remind him of the life he'd once dreamed of having. The sudden sound of stumbling footsteps on his porch made him freeze. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 hanging from a peg near the door. Out here, 15 miles from the nearest town, visitors after dark meant trouble. The footsteps stopped, followed by a soft thud against his door. Not a knock, more like something collapsing against the wood. "Please." The voice was barely a whisper, female, desperate. "Please, help me." Jonah stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours of sitting. He approached the door with his pistol drawn, every nerve on edge. Through a crack in the shutters, he could make out a figure in white collapsed against his door. Blood. Even in the dim light, he could see blood. He unbarred the door carefully, weapon ready. The figure that tumbled inside made him catch his breath. A young woman couldn't be more than 25, wearing what had once been a wedding dress. The white satin was torn in a dozen places, stained with blood and desert dirt. Her feet were bare and bleeding, leaving crimson prints on his floor. Her dark hair hung in wild tangles around a face marked by terror and exhaustion. "Please," she gasped, trying to push herself up from where she'd fallen. "They're coming. He's coming. I can't go back." Jonah holstered his weapon and knelt beside her, his hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her to a sitting position. "Who's coming? What happened to you?" Her eyes, green as sage in the lamplight, met his with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Victor Hale," she whispered, and Jonah's blood turned to ice. I was supposed to be his wife. Tonight. But I couldn't. I ran." The sound of baying hounds in the distance made them both freeze. They were still far off, but sound carried in the desert night. Jonah made a decision that would change everything. "Can you stand?" he asked. She nodded, though her legs shook like a newborn colt's. Jonah helped her to her feet, noting how she flinched at his touch, not from pain, but from something deeper. Someone had hurt this woman, and recently. "I'm not clean anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking. Before the ceremony, he said he wanted to inspect his property. I fought him. That's when I ran." Rage, hot and familiar, flooded through Jonah's chest. The same rage he'd felt at Willow Creek, watching Hale's men torch that church. The same rage that had sustained him through 3 years of war and 10 years of empty nights since. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady and sure. "You're safe here. I won't let him take you." "You don't understand," Clara said, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on her face. "He owns half this territory. The sheriff, the judge, they're all his men. My father, he lost me in a poker game. Can you imagine his own daughter wagered like a horse or a plot of land? And when Hale came to collect, she shuddered. Jonah guided her to a chair, then moved quickly around the cabin, barring windows and checking his rifles. He had 3 his old Spencer repeater from the war, a Winchester 73, and a Sharp's Buffalo gun that could drop a man at 1,000 yards. He began loading them all. "What's your name?" he asked as he worked. Clara Whitmore." She watched him with those green eyes, seeing the practiced efficiency of his movements. "You're military." "Was Union Army." "Union. Sharpshooter with the 2nd Wisconsin." He finished with the rifles and turned to face her. "And I know exactly who Victor Hale is, what he's capable of." The dogs were closer now, their baying echoing off the canyon walls. Clara stood swaying slightly. "I should go. I've brought trouble to your door. He'll kill you for harboring me." "Sit down," Jonah said firmly. "He'll try. There's a difference." He disappeared into the cabin's small back room, returning with clothes, a man's shirt and trousers worn, but clean. "These were my brothers. Put them on. That dress is a beacon in the night, and you need to be able to move." Clara took the clothes, gratefully disappearing into the back room. Jonah used the moment to step onto his porch, scanning the darkness. He could see torches now, maybe a mile off, winding through the canyon like a river of fire. At least a dozen riders, maybe more. When Clara emerged, the transformation was remarkable. Even in men's clothes that were too large for her frame, she looked stronger, more capable. She'd tied her hair back and washed the worst of the blood from her face. But her feet were still bare and bleeding. Jonah handed her a pair of boots. Also Samuel's. Might be a bit big, but they'll do. As she pulled them on, he asked, "Can you shoot?" "My father taught me, before he became what he is now." Bitterness crept into her voice. Before the gambling consumed him, Jonah handed her a Navy Colt smaller than his Army model. 6 shots. Make them count if it comes to that. The sound of horses was clear now, hoofbeats thundering closer. Jonah extinguished the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the shutters. They waited in the darkness, listening to the approaching storm. Carver. The voice that rang out was deep, commanding, with traces of a southern drawl that 10 years in the territories hadn't erased. Victor Hale. "Jonah Carver. I know you're in there. Send out my property and we can avoid unpleasantness." Clara started to speak, but Jonah placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. He moved to the window, calling out, "Don't know what you're talking about, Hale. I'm alone here, same as always." "Don't lie to me, boy. We tracked her here. Her blood's on your porch. My dogs don't lie." Hale's voice carried a tone of amused contempt. "Send her out and I might forget you interfered with a legal marriage." "Legal?" Jonah laughed, harsh and bitter. "Since when is buying a woman in a card game legal?" "Since her father signed the contract, witnessed and notarized. She belongs to me, Carver. The law's on my side." "Your law, maybe. Not God's law. Not any decent man's law." There was a pause, then Hale spoke again, his voice harder now. "I remember you, Carver. That self-righteous Union sharpshooter. Still carrying a torch for Willow Creek, are you?" "That was war, boy. Ancient history." "Oh, not ancient enough," Jonah replied. "Some things don't deserve forgetting." 5 minutes, Carver. Send her out, or we're coming in. And I promise you what happens next won't be pleasant for either of you." Jonah turned to Clara, whose face was pale but determined in the moonlight. "There's a root cellar beneath the floor," he whispered. "If this goes bad—" "No," she interrupted. "I'm not hiding. Not anymore. I've been hiding my whole life from my father's debts, from the men he owed, from what I knew was coming. If I'm going to die tonight, I'll do it standing." Something in her voice, a steel that hadn't been there before, made Jonah nod with respect. "Then we make our stand together." He positioned her at the side window, showing her the sight lines. "They'll likely come from 3 directions, front door, back door, and this window. The bedroom window's too small for a man to fit through. Watch the approach from the corral. Anyone comes that way, you put them down." "I've never killed anyone," she whispered. "Neither had I before the war. First time's hard. After that, it's just survival." He checked his rifle one more time. "Remember, they chose to come here. They chose violence. You're just choosing to live." The 5 minutes passed in tense silence. Then, without warning, the attack began. The front door exploded inward, kicked open by a massive man carrying a shotgun. Jonas Spencer barked once, and the man tumbled backward into the night. Immediately, gunfire erupted from all sides, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. Clara saw movement at her window, a shadow creeping toward the corral. She raised the Navy Colt, her hands surprisingly steady, and fired. The shadow yelped and retreated. Her second shot was more confident, catching another figure trying to flank them. The man went down with a scream. "Good shooting," Jonah called out, firing his Winchester through the front window. He'd barricaded the door with an overturned table, and bullets thudded into the thick wood like hail. The firefight raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Jonah moved between windows with practiced efficiency, picking off attackers with mechanical precision. Clara held her position, making every shot count. The Navy Colt clicked empty, and Jonah tossed her his spare Army Colt without missing a beat. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. "Carver," Hale's voice rang out again. "You've killed 3 of my men. That's murder. You understand I've got witnesses. You'll hang for this." "Self-defense isn't murder, Hale. You attacked my home. I was retrieving stolen property. My legal wife." "She's not property," Clara shouted before Jonah could stop her. "I'm a person, you bastard, a human being." Hale laughed cold and mirthless. "You're whatever I paid for, girl, and your daddy's debt was considerable. You think this ends tonight? I own the law in 3 counties. You'll both be fugitives come morning. Is that what you want, Carver, to throw away your life for some whore who—" The Sharp's rifle boomed like thunder, and the torch Hale had been holding exploded in a shower of sparks. The message was clear. Jonah could have killed him, but chose not to. "Next one goes through your head, Hale. Take your men and go. The girl stays here." There was a long silence, then the sound of horses being mounted. "This isn't over, Carver. Not by a long shot. I'll be back with a warrant and a dozen deputies, legal-like, and then we'll see how tough you are." The riders departed, their torchlight receding into the distance like dying embers. Jonah and Clara remained at their posts for another hour, watching, waiting, making sure it wasn't a trick. Finally, when the night had returned to its natural quiet, Jonah lit a single candle. In the soft light, they could see the damage. The cabin was riddled with bullet holes, the front door destroyed, windows shattered. 3 bodies lay in the yard. Hale's men who'd paid the ultimate price for their employer's obsession. Clara was shaking now, the adrenaline fading. "What have I done? What have we done? We—" Jonah placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We survived. That's what we did. He'll be back. Yes. With the law. His version of it." Clara looked up at him, seeing clearly for the first time the man who'd saved her. His face was weathered but handsome in a rough way, with intelligent blue eyes that held depths of pain and determination. Gray touched his temples and lines etched the corners of his eyes. Laugh lines, though she doubted he'd laughed much in recent years. "Why?" she asked. "Why risk everything for a stranger?" Jonah was quiet for a long moment, then walked to a small chest in the corner. He pulled out a yellowed photograph, handing it to her. It showed a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Her name was Mary. We were engaged before the war. She lived in a town called Willow Creek in Missouri. Neutral territory supposedly, but Hale's raiders didn't care about neutrality. They burned the church during Sunday service. Mary was inside along with 36 others. I was 2 days right away with my unit. By the time we arrived," he trailed off, taking the photograph back. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. After the war, Hale disappeared into the territories, reinvented himself as a respectable rancher. But I knew, I've always known. And when you said his name tonight, when I saw what he'd done to you, I couldn't stand by, not again. Clara understood then. This wasn't just about her. This was about redemption, about standing up when it mattered, about not letting history repeat itself. "What do we do now?" she asked. Now we prepare. He'll be back like he said. But maybe we can be ready for him." Jonah moved to the door, studying the bodies in his yard. "These men need burying. Don't want to give him ammunition about us disrespecting the dead. I'll help." "You should rest. You've been through—" "I said I'll help." Her voice was firm. "They came here because of me. The least I can do is help bury them." They worked through the remaining hours of night digging 3 graves in the hard desert soil. It was backbreaking work, but somehow cathartic. As they worked, Clara told Jonah her story about her father's decline after her mother's death, about the gambling debts that had mounted until he had nothing left to wager but his daughter, about the moment Hale had walked into their home with a bill of sale looking at her like she was livestock. "I tried to run then," she said, pausing to wipe sweat from her brow despite the cold. "But he had men watching the house. Tonight was supposed to be the wedding, small ceremony, just the judge and witnesses. Hale said he wanted to break me in before the vows, said it was his right as my future husband. When he came to my room," she trailed off, and Jonah didn't push. Some stories didn't need finishing. As dawn broke across the desert painting, the mountains purple and gold, they stood beside the 3 fresh graves. Jonah had fashioned simple crosses from spare wood, though he doubted any of these men deserved such consideration. "Should we say something?" Clara asked. "They made their choices," Jonah replied. "But every man deserves a prayer, I suppose." He removed his hat, and Clara bowed her head as he spoke. "Lord, we commend these souls to your judgment. They chose a dark path, followed a dark man, and met a dark end. May they find in death the peace they denied others in life. Amen." "Amen," Clara echoed. They returned to the cabin as the sun climbed higher. In daylight, the damage looked even worse. The place Jonah had called home for 5 years was all but destroyed. "I'm sorry," Clara said, surveying the wreckage. "This is my fault." "No," Jonah said firmly. "This is Hale's fault. All of it. You were just trying to be free." A dust cloud on the horizon caught their attention. Riders approaching, still distant but coming fast. Jonah grabbed his Spencer rifle but then relaxed slightly. Just one rider, not Hale's style. As the figure drew closer, they could make out a man in black clothing on a gray mare. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. When he was within hailing distance, Jonah recognized him. "Reverend Parker," he called out. Reverend Elias Parker was an oddity in the territory, a man of God who wore a gun and wasn't afraid to use it. He'd been a chaplain in the Union Army, had seen too much death to believe in pure pacifism. Now he ministered to the lost souls of the frontier, offering salvation with one hand and justice with the other when needed. "Jonah," the Reverend said, dismounting. His eyes took in the bullet-riddled cabin, the fresh graves, and Clara in her men's clothes. "I heard there was some excitement out this way. Hale's men rode through town before dawn, several of them bleeding. They said you'd kidnapped his bride." "I left of my own will," Clara said, stepping forward. "This man saved my life." Parker studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you, miss. I've known Hale for what he is for some time now, evil wearing a respectable mask." He turned to Jonah. "You know he's gone to the federal marshal in Tucson, claims you murdered his men and kidnapped Miss Whitmore here." "Let him come," Jonah said grimly. "It's not that simple. He's got papers, a legal marriage contract signed by her father. In the eyes of the law—" "The law be damned," Clara interrupted. "No piece of paper gives him the right to—" She stopped, composing herself. "To treat me as he did." Parker's expression softened. "I agree completely, miss, which is why I'm here. There might be a way to fight this, but not with guns. At least not only with guns." He reached into his saddlebags, pulling out a wrapped bundle. "Your father came to me 3 nights ago, Miss Whitmore. He was drunk, rambling, but also terrified. Said he'd made a terrible mistake, that Hale was more monster than man. He gave me this, told me to keep it safe, that it might be the only way to save you." Clara took the bundle with trembling hands, unwrapping it carefully. Inside was a leather journal, water-stained and worn, and several official-looking documents. "What is this?" she asked. "I don't know. Your father left before explaining, but he said Hale would kill to get these back." Jonah took the journal, opening it carefully. His expression darkened as he read. "It's a military journal. Confederate. Captain Victor Hale, commanding irregular cavalry." He flipped through pages. "Raids, ambushes, and God Almighty." "What?" Clara asked. "Willow Creek. It's all here. His own account of the massacre. He's proud of it. Calls it a necessary lesson in the price of harboring Union sympathizers." Jonah's hands shook with rage. "Names, dates, details. This is proof. After all these years, actual proof." Parker examined the other documents. These are interesting too. Land deeds, but they're forgeries. Clever ones, but forgeries nonetheless. Looks like Hale's been stealing land throughout the territory using forged documents to claim ownership. If this got to the right authorities, he'd hang, Jonah finished, for war crimes if nothing else. The Union Army's been looking for the Willow Creek butchers for 10 years. How did my father get these? Clara asked. Hale was drunk one night, Parker explained, boasting about his conquests, his cleverness. Your father was tending bar listening. When Hale passed out, your father went through his things. Found these in a hidden compartment in Hale's saddlebags. He thought he could use them as leverage, maybe win back his debts. But when he sobered up, he realized what he'd really found. Evidence of a monster. And then he still gave me to him, Clara said bitterly. He was trying to buy time, Parker said gently. He told me he thought if he complied with the marriage, Hale wouldn't suspect anything. He was going to take these to the federal authorities after you were safe. Safe. He delivered me to a rapist and murderer. He was a weak man, miss. But in the end, he tried to do right. These documents are his attempt at redemption. Jonah was still reading the journal, his face growing darker with each page. There's more here. Names of other men involved. Some of them are prominent now, judges, territorial legislators, even a federal marshal. Hale's built a network of former Confederates, all with blood on their hands, all protecting each other. Then we can't trust any local law, Clara said. No, but there's a new federal prosecutor in Phoenix, Samuel Grant. He's got a reputation for being incorruptible. If we could get these to him. Phoenix is 3 days' ride, Jonah said. Hale will come for us long before that. Then we make copies, Parker suggested. I can telegraph the essential details to Grant ask for federal intervention, but we'll need to keep Hale at bay until help arrives. How long A week, maybe 2. Jonah looked around his ruined cabin. We can't defend this place again. Too exposed, too damaged. There's the old mission, Parker said. San Miguel about 10 miles north. Adobe walls 3 feet thick. Good sight lines, a well for water. It's been abandoned for years, but it's defensible. And Hale knows I know about it, Clara added. My father and I stayed there once when we were traveling. He mentioned it to Hale, trying to seem helpful. Hale said it would make a good stronghold if the Apache ever rose up again. Then he might expect us to go there, Jonah said. It could be a trap. Or it could be our salvation, Parker countered. I can rally some good men from town, not many but a few who've stood up to Hale before, men who've lost land or loved ones to his schemes. You'd do that risk your congregation. Parker's eyes hardened. I've been preaching about standing up to evil for 5 years, Jonah. Time I practiced what I preach. Besides, he patted the colt on his hip. The Lord helps those who help themselves. They spent the morning preparing. Clara helped Jonah gather what supplies and ammunition had survived the attack. Parker rode back to town to send his telegraph and recruit allies. They agreed to meet at the mission at sunset. As Clara packed provisions into saddlebags, she found herself working alongside Jonah in comfortable silence. There was something solid about him, she realized. Something unshakable. He'd been broken by loss, yes, but he'd reformed himself around that break like a tree, growing around a fence post, incorporating the damage into something stronger. You don't have to do this, she said suddenly. You could leave. Disappear into the territories. Start over somewhere Hale can't reach. Jonah stopped what he was doing, turning to face her. Could you leave knowing what we know, knowing what he is, what he'll continue to do? No, she admitted. I couldn't. Then we're the same, you and I. Some fights you don't walk away from, even if you could. Is that what this is, a fight? It's a reckoning, Jonah said. 10 years in the making, maybe longer. Men like Hale, they think the war never ended. They're still fighting. It's still trying to own people, control them through fear. Someone needs to show them they're wrong. Clara studied his face, seeing the determination etched there. And you think we can, a broken soldier, a runaway bride, and a gun-toting preacher? David was just a shepherd boy with a sling, Jonah replied. Sometimes that's enough. They loaded everything onto Jonah's 2 horses, a sturdy bay gelding, and a gray mare he'd been keeping as a spare. Clara had never ridden astride before, only side saddle, as was proper for a lady, but propriety had died the moment she'd run from Hale's house. Keep your weight centered, Jonah instructed, adjusting her stirrups. Move with the horse, not against it. And if we have to run, lean forward and give her her head. Buttercup knows these trails better than any of Hale's men. Buttercup. Clara couldn't help but smile. This fierce war horse is named Buttercup. Samuel named her. He had a soft spot for gentle names on tough animals. Said it reminded them they didn't always have to be hard. As they mounted up, Clara took one last look at Jonah's cabin. I'm sorry about your home. It was just a building, Jonah said, though she could see the loss in his eyes. Home isn't a place. It's people. It's purpose. Maybe I've been hiding here too long anyway. They rode north as the sun climbed toward noon, following game trails that wound through canyons and arroyos. Jonah led his Spencer rifle across his saddle, constantly scanning for threats. Clara followed, finding her rhythm on Buttercup, feeling more free than she had in years despite the danger pursuing them. The mission appeared as they crested a ridge, its adobe walls glowing gold in the afternoon sun. It had been built a century ago by Spanish missionaries abandoned when the Apache Wars made the region too dangerous. Now it stood as a monument to faith and endurance, its bell tower still reaching toward heaven despite the years of neglect. It's beautiful, Clara said. It's defensive, Jonah corrected, but she caught him looking at the structure with something approaching appreciation. Good fields of fire, limited approaches, thick walls. We can hold this place. They entered through the main gate, finding the courtyard overgrown with desert plants but structurally sound. The chapel stood at the center, its heavy wooden doors still intact. Around the perimeter were smaller buildings, quarters for priests, storage rooms, a kitchen. We'll set up in the chapel, Jonah decided. It's the strongest building, and the bell tower gives us high ground. They spent the afternoon fortifying their position. Clara helped Jonah barricade windows, creating firing positions with good cover. They found old furniture to block doorways, stationed water barrels at strategic points in case of fire, and cached ammunition where it could be easily reached. As the sun began to set, riders appeared on the southern horizon. Clara tensed, but Jonah relaxed when he saw Parker's distinctive black coat. The Reverend had brought 5 men with him, a small force, but each one had a reason to stand against Hale. There was Tom Martinez, whose brother had been killed by Hale's men in a legal land dispute. Ben Cooper, a former slave who'd come west for freedom, only to find men like Hale trying to impose a different kind of bondage. The Grayson brothers twins, whose family ranch had been seized through Hale's forged documents. And surprisingly, Robert Downs, the town's undertaker, a quiet man who'd seen too many of Hale's victims. It's not much of an army, Parker admitted as they gathered in the chapel. But these are good men. They know what we're fighting for. It's enough, Jonah said, though privately he had doubts. 7 men and 1 woman against Hale's dozens. The odds were long. Parker had news from town. The telegraph went through. Grant's office responded. They're very interested in what we have, especially the war crimes evidence. But they need the original documents, and it'll take time to mobilize federal marshals. How much time? 10 days minimum. Hale won't wait that long, Tom Martinez said. He's gathering men, offering top dollar for guns. He'll have 40, maybe 50 riders by tomorrow night. Then we make them pay for every inch, Jonah said. This mission has stood for 100 years. It'll stand a few days more. That night they took turns on watch. Clara found herself paired with Jonah on the bell tower, looking out over the moonlit desert. The night was quiet except for the distant howl of coyotes. Are you afraid? She asked. Always, Jonah admitted. Fear keeps you sharp. It's when you stop being afraid that you make mistakes. I thought soldiers were supposed to be fearless. Only dead soldiers are fearless. The rest of us just learn to function despite the fear. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, then Clara asked, What will you do after this is over? Assuming we survive. Assuming that. Jonah considered. I don't know. For 10 years, finding justice for Willow Creek has been my only purpose. Without that, he shrugged, you could start over, build a new cabin. Maybe not so isolated this time. Maybe, he said, looking at her in the moonlight. What about you? I want to teach, Clara said without hesitation. Start a school. Give children the education I was lucky enough to receive before everything fell apart. Knowledge is freedom. If I'd known more about the law, about my rights, Maybe I could have fought my father's contract. You're fighting it now, with guns and violence. That's not the world I want to help create. Sometimes violence is necessary to protect the peaceful world we want to build, Jonah said. I've seen what happens when good people refuse to fight. Evil flourishes. Before Clara could respond, a light appeared in the distance. Then another, and another. Torches, dozens of them, moving toward the mission like a river of fire. They're coming, Jonah said, his voice calm. Go ring the bell. Wake everyone. Clara ran down the tower stairs, her heart pounding. She grabbed the bell rope and pulled with all her strength. The bronze bell, silent for decades, rang out across the desert, a clarion call that seemed to shake the very stars. Within minutes, everyone was at their positions. Parker and the Grayson brothers took the main gate. Martinez and Cooper positioned themselves at windows covering the courtyard. Downs, despite his lack of combat experience, manned a position in the bell tower with a rifle. Jonah moved between positions, checking fields of fire, offering encouragement. Clara found herself at a window in the chapel, the Navy Colt once again in her hands. This time she noticed they weren't shaking. The torches stopped just outside rifle range. A lone rider advanced carrying a white flag. In the torchlight, Clara recognized him. Sheriff Watson, one of Hale's bought men. Carver, Watson called out. I've got warrants for you and the woman, murder and kidnapping. Come out peaceful-like, and you'll get a fair trial. Fair like the trial those folks at Willow Creek got, Jonah called back. Tell Hale to come himself if he wants to talk. I'm done dealing with his puppets. Watson retreated, and for a few minutes there was only the crackle of torches and the whisper of wind. Then Hale himself rode forward, still outside rifle range, but close enough to be heard clearly. You've caused me considerable trouble, Carver, he said, his voice carrying that same amused contempt. All this for a woman who's not even yours. This isn't about her, Jonah replied. Not anymore. This is about Willow Creek, about 37 souls crying out for justice. There was a pause, then Hale laughed. Willow Creek. You're still carrying that torch. It was war, you fool. Things happen in war. Murder happened. Your journal makes that clear. Every bloody detail. The laughter stopped. What journal? The one you kept. The one where you bragged about burning that church, about shooting anyone who tried to escape, about how the screams sounded like angels welcoming the righteous home. Even from a distance, they could see Hale stiffen in his saddle. You're lying. Should I read some excerpts? I particularly like the part where you describe my Mary's face in the church window, just before the roof collapsed. You called it poetic justice against Union sympathizers. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. When Hale spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of civility. Kill them all. Burn the mission to the ground. Leave nothing but ashes. The attack came from all sides simultaneously. Rifle fire erupted like thunder muzzle flashes, strobing in the darkness. The defenders responded with disciplined fire, picking their targets carefully. Jonah's Spencer rifle barked steadily, each shot finding its mark. Clara fired when she had clear targets, remembering Jonah's advice about making each shot count. In the bell tower, Downs proved surprisingly effective, his undertaker's attention to detail serving him well as a marksman. But Hale had brought overwhelming numbers. For every attacker that fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. They pressed forward, using cover, advancing steadily on the mission. They're at the walls, Cooper shouted. Claire could see men with scaling ladders approaching the western wall. She shifted her position to cover them, but there were too many. Then she remembered something: the old mission had been built with defense in mind. The murder holes, she shouted to Jonah. In the walls, the missionaries built murder holes for fighting Apache. Jonah understood immediately. He grabbed a bucket of lamp oil they'd prepared and ran to the western wall. Sure enough, there were small openings near the base, angled downward. He poured oil through them onto the attackers below, then dropped a lit torch after it. The screams were terrible but effective. The western assault faltered men retreating from the flames. But on the eastern side, Hale's men had reached the gate. The sound of axes on wood echoed through the courtyard. Parker and the Grayson brothers poured fire into them, but the gate was weakening. Fall back to the chapel, Jonah ordered. The defenders retreated in good order, covering each other. They'd planned for this, turning the chapel into their final redoubt. Its walls were thicker, its windows smaller and higher. They could hold here. As they barricaded the chapel doors, Clara noticed Tom Martinez was bleeding from a shoulder wound. She tore strips from her shirt to bandage it, her hands steady despite the chaos around them. "Just a graze," Martinez said through gritted teeth. "I've had worse." The mission gate gave way with a crash, and Hale's men poured into the courtyard, but crossing the open space to reach the chapel would cost them. Every window became a portal of death, the defenders' rifles cutting down anyone who tried to cross. Then Clara smelled smoke. Not gun smoke, wood smoke. "They're trying to burn us out," Downs called from the tower. Sure enough, flames were licking at the chapel's wooden doors. The adobe walls wouldn't burn, but the roof was wooden covered with tar. If that caught fire... "We need to stop those flames," Parker said. "It's suicide to go out there," Cooper protested. "Then we die in here just slower," Jonah said. He looked at their water barrels. They had enough to fight the fire, but someone would have to go outside to use it. "I'll go," Clara said. "No," Jonah said immediately. "I'm the smallest, the fastest. I can reach the door and back before—" I said no. But Clara was already moving. She grabbed a water bucket and slipped out the side door before anyone could stop her. The courtyard was chaos, smoke, gunfire, shouting men. Clara ran along the wall, staying in shadow, the bucket heavy in her hands. She could see the flames growing at the main door, fed by oil and kindling Hale's men, had piled there. She was 10 feet from the fire when a hand grabbed her arm, spinning her around. One of Hale's men, his face twisted with cruel pleasure. Well, well, the runaway bride herself. Clara didn't hesitate. She swung the bucket with all her strength, catching him in the face. He staggered back and she drew the Navy Colt, shooting him point blank. He fell, and she continued to the fire, dousing the worst of the flames. But more men had seen her. Bullets whined past as she ran back toward the chapel. She could see Jonah at the door, laying down, covering fire, his face a mask of controlled fury. She was almost there when pain exploded through her side. She stumbled, her hand coming away red when she touched the wound. But momentum carried her forward, and Jonah pulled her inside, slamming the door behind them. "You fool," he said, but his hands were gentle as he examined the wound. "Clean through. You're lucky." "Doesn't feel lucky," Clara gasped. Parker was at her side, immediately using his medical training from the war to clean and bind the wound. "You'll live," he said, "but you need to stay down." The battle raged on. Dawn came slowly, painting the smoke-filled air with orange and red. The defenders were exhausted, low on ammunition. Several were wounded, but they'd held. As the sun rose fully, Hale's attacks became less coordinated. His men were tired too, and they'd lost many, at least 15 dead, more wounded. The courtyard was littered with bodies. Then unexpectedly, the attack stopped altogether. "What are they doing?" Ben Cooper asked, peering carefully through a window. Jonah climbed to the bell tower, using his field glasses to survey the situation. What he saw made him curse. "They're pulling back," he called down, "but not retreating. They're setting up a siege." It made sense. Hale had the numbers to surround the mission, cut them off from water and supplies. Time was on his side, or so he thought. "He doesn't know about the telegraph," Parker said. "He thinks he has all the time in the world." "We still need to survive until help arrives," Jonah pointed out. "We're low on ammunition, we have wounded, and that well in the courtyard is exposed to their fire." "Then we wait for night to get water," Martinez said. "We've held this long. We can hold longer." The day passed slowly. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the chapel into an oven. The wounded suffered in the heat, and everyone's throats grew parched. But they held. As afternoon wore on, Clara, despite her wound, insisted on taking a watch. She positioned herself where she could see the main approach to the mission. That's when she noticed the dust cloud on the southern horizon. "Jonah," she called, "someone's coming." He climbed up beside her, wincing at her pallor. She'd lost more blood than she'd admitted. Looking through his field glasses, his expression grew grim. "It's Hale's reinforcements. 20 more riders, maybe 30. Hearts sank around the chapel. They couldn't hold against that many. Not in their current state. But as the riders drew closer, something strange happened. Instead of joining Hale's siege lines, they rode straight through, scattering his men. Gunfire erupted, but it wasn't directed at the mission. "What in the hell?" Jonah muttered. Then his face lit up. That's a cavalry guidon. Those are army troops. Sure enough, the approaching riders wore Union blue. At their head rode a man with captain's bars, his sword drawn, as he led a charge into Hale's confused forces. The siege collapsed into chaos. Hale's men caught between the cavalry and the mission defenders scattered. Some tried to fight, others ran for their horses. The battle was brief but decisive. Within an hour, it was over. The cavalry captain rode up to the mission gates, calling out, "I'm Captain James Morrison, 6th Cavalry, out of Fort Grant. We're responding to a federal warrant for one Victor Hale wanted for war crimes and murder. Is Marshal Carver here?" "Marshal?" Clara asked, looking at Jonah. He looked as confused as she did. "I'm Jonah Carver, but I'm no marshal." Captain Morrison dismounted, entering the chapel with proper military bearing. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of sharp intelligence that suggested rapid promotion. "Mr. Carver, by order of federal prosecutor Samuel Grant, you've been deputized as a United States Marshal with authority to arrest Victor Hale and his conspirators." He handed Jonah an official-looking document. "The evidence you provided via telegraph was compelling enough for immediate action. We've been riding hard for 2 days." But the telegraph said 10 days. That was before we knew what we were dealing with. The Willow Creek massacre has been an open wound for the Army for 10 years. When Grant saw your evidence, he made this highest priority. There's a federal judge riding a day behind us with warrants for 24 men. "Where's Hale?" Jonah asked. Morrison's expression darkened. "Escaped in the chaos. A dozen of his men with him. We have trackers on them, but he knows this territory." Clara struggled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her side. "He'll run for Mexico. He has contacts there, people who'll hide him." "Then we need to move fast," Morrison said.
Jonah asked. "You know him better than anyone. You know how he thinks. We need you on this hunt, Marshal." Jonah looked at Clara, torn between duty and concern for her welfare. "Go," she said. "This needs to end. I'll be safe here with the Reverend and the others." But before Jonah could respond, one of Morrison's scouts rode in at full gallop. "Captain Hale's doubled back. He's heading north toward the old Butterfield stage route." Why would he go north? Morrison wondered. Clara gasped, understanding hitting her. "The documents. We have the originals here. He knows he's finished if those reach a federal court. He's coming back for them." Morrison immediately began issuing orders, preparing defenses, but Jonah was already moving. He gathered the journal and land deeds, wrapping them carefully. "I'll take these and ride out, Mort," he said. "Draw him away from here." "That's suicide," Morrison protested. "You'll be alone against a dozen men." "No," Clara said, standing despite the pain. "We go together. He wants me as much as those documents. I'm the witness to his crimes, the one who got away. His pride won't let him leave without me. You're wounded. I can ride." Her green eyes blazed with determination. "This started with me running from him. It ends with me standing against him." Jonah wanted to protest, but he saw the steel in her that had first appeared that night in his cabin. She'd earned the right to see this through. "The old mine," Parker said suddenly. "The Bonanza silver mine 5 miles northwest. It's a maze of tunnels. You could hold off an army in there. Or get trapped," Morrison pointed out. "Not if you know the tunnels," Clara said. "My father worked that mine before it played out. He showed me the passages. There's a back entrance through the mountain, comes out near Crystal Creek." Jonah made a decision. "We'll take the documents to the mine, draw Hale after us. Captain, you follow with your men, but give us a head start. Make it look like we're running desperate." "That's because we are desperate," Clara muttered, but she was already preparing, checking her weapons. Morrison didn't like it, but he recognized the tactical wisdom. 15-minute head start, then we follow." Jonah and Clara mounted up him on his bay, her on Buttercup despite her wound. The documents were in Jonah's saddlebags, the journal tucked inside his coat. They rode hard toward the northwest dust rising behind them like a signal fire. Sure enough, within minutes they could see riders peeling off from the northern approach, changing direction to pursue them. Hale had taken the bait. The mine entrance yawned before them, a black mouth in the mountainside. They dismounted, sending the horses on with slaps to their rumps. The animals knew their way home and would lead Morrison to their location. "Ready?" Jonah asked. Clara checked the Navy Colt one more time. "Let's finish this."
They entered the darkness of the mine, their footsteps echoing off stone walls. Clara led, remembering the paths her father had shown her. The main tunnel split 3 ways about 50 yards in. She took the left passage, which led deeper into the mountain. Behind them, they could hear Hale's men arriving, horses snorting, men shouting. Then Hale's voice echoing through the tunnels. "I know you're in there, Carver. There's no escape. Give me what's mine, the documents and the girl, and I might let you live." Jonah responded by firing his Spencer down the tunnel, the shot booming in the confined space. Someone screamed. He'd found a target. "Have it your way," Hale called. "Boys, flush them out." The hunt through the mine was nightmarish. Darkness broken by muzzle flashes, the air thick with gun smoke and dust. Clara led them through passages barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, over pits that dropped into blackness, through chambers where a whisper echoed like thunder. They had advantages: Clara's knowledge of the layout, the fact that Hale's men had to come at them through narrow passages where numbers meant nothing. But they were running low on ammunition, and Clara was weakening from her wound. In a chamber lit by a shaft of sunlight from above, they stopped to rest. Clara slumped against a wall, her breathing labored. "Go," she said. "Take the documents and go. The back entrance is just ahead. We've had this discussion. I'm not leaving you." "You're a fool, Jonah Carver." "Maybe, but I'm your fool now." Despite everything, she smiled. Then her expression changed to alarm as shadows moved in the tunnel behind them. They ran, Clara stumbling, Jonah half carrying her. The back entrance was just ahead. They could see daylight. But as they emerged, blinking in the sudden brightness, they found themselves facing 3 of Hale's men who'd circled around the mountain. Jonah shot 2 before his rifle clicked empty. The third man raised his weapon, aiming at Clara. Jonah moved without thinking, stepping in front of her as the gun fired. The impact spun him around, dropping him to his knees. Blood spread across his shirt, but he managed to draw his Colt, firing once. The third man fell. "Jonah!" Clara caught him as he swayed. "Take the documents," he gasped, pressing the journal into her hands. "Run! Morrison will be here soon." "I'm not leaving you." "Clara." "No." She helped him lean against a rock, then turned to face the mine entrance, the Navy Colt steady in her hands. Victor Hale emerged from the darkness, his clothes dusty, his face twisted with rage. He had 2 men with him, but he gestured for them to hold back. "So it ends," he said, looking at Jonah's blood, at Clara standing defiant before him. "All this for nothing. You think those documents matter. I have judges, marshals, politicians in my pocket. The system is mine." "Not anymore," Clara said. "Captain Morrison has copies. They're already on their way to Washington. Your war crimes, your forgeries, your murders, it's all over Hale." His face darkened. "Then you've accomplished nothing but your own deaths. If I'm finished, I'll at least have the satisfaction of watching you both die." He raised his pistol, aiming at Clara. Time seemed to slow. She could see his finger tightening on the trigger, could see the hatred in his eyes. She thought of all the running, all the fear, all the people he'd hurt. "No more?" she whispered. She fired the Navy Colt, the gun Jonah had given her that first night. Her aim was true. The bullet caught Hale between the eyes, and he toppled backward, his unfired gun falling from his hand. His 2 remaining men stood frozen, shocked. Then the thunder of hooves filled the air as Morrison's cavalry arrived. The men threw down their weapons, surrendering immediately. Clara dropped to her knees beside Jonah, pressing her hands against his wound. "Stay with me. Help is here. You're going to be fine." He reached up, touching her face with a blood-stained hand. "You did it. You stood your ground." "We did it," she corrected, tears streaming down her face. Morrison's medic was there, immediately working on Jonah with practiced efficiency. "He'll live," he announced after a tense examination. "Bullet missed anything vital. He's tough." As they loaded Jonah onto a stretcher, he managed to catch Clara's hand. "What you said in the mine, about being my fool." She squeezed his hand. "I meant it." The cavalry medic worked with steady hands as blood seeped through the makeshift bandages, his face grim but focused. Clara refused to let go of Jonah's hand, even as Captain Morrison gently tried to guide her away to have her own wound examined. The sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky ground outside the mine, and she could hear the soldiers rounding up the last of Hale's men, their voices echoing off the canyon walls.
Miss Whitmore, Morrison said softly, you need medical attention too. That wound in your side. I'm fine, she said, though her voice shook and dark spots danced at the edges of her vision. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the mine was fading, leaving only pain and exhaustion. Jonah's eyes fluttered open, finding hers immediately. Listen to the captain, he managed, his voice rough. Can't have you bleeding out after all this. Stubborn woman, Parker's voice came from behind them. The Reverend had arrived with reinforcements from the mission, his black coat dusty from hard riding. Both of you, actually, made for each other in that regard. The medic finished his field dressing and nodded to Morrison. We need to get him back to the mission. I can work better there, and then we can transport them both to Fort Grant's hospital. As the soldiers carefully lifted Jonah onto a travois, Clara finally allowed Parker to examine her wound. The bullet had passed through cleanly, but the ride and the fight had torn it open again. Fresh blood soaked through her makeshift bandages. You're lucky, Parker said as he worked. An inch to the left and we'd be having a different conversation. Seems everyone keeps telling me I'm lucky, Clara said, watching as they secured Jonah for transport. Funny how being shot doesn't feel particularly fortunate. They made a slow procession back to the mission, Morrison's men maintaining a protective perimeter while others dealt with the captured and the dead. Victor Hale's body was wrapped in canvas and loaded onto a pack horse, his reign of terror ending with far less ceremony than he would have imagined. At the mission, the chapel had been transformed into a makeshift hospital. Tom Martinez lay on one pallet, his shoulder properly bandaged now, while Ben Cooper sat having a gash on his forehead stitched. The Grayson brothers were uninjured but exhausted, slumped against the wall, sharing a canteen. Is it over? The older Grayson asked as they brought Jonah in. Hale's dead, Morrison confirmed. His network will crumble without him. The evidence Marshal Carver uncovered will see to that. Marshal Carver, Jonah muttered from his stretcher. Still sounds wrong. Better get used to it, Morrison said. Grant was serious about that appointment, assuming you want it, of course. Clara helped the medic clean and properly dress Jonah's wound. The bullet had entered just below his ribs, tearing through muscle but miraculously missing organs and major blood vessels. He would heal given time and rest. The documents, Jonah said, suddenly trying to sit up. Where? Safe, Clara assured him, pressing him back down. She produced the journal from inside her coat along with the forged land deeds. Though they're a bit blood-stained now. That'll just make them more convincing in court, Morrison said dryly. He took the documents, carefully placing them in an official dispatch case. These will be in Judge Harrison's hands by tomorrow. He's already issued warrants based on the telegraph copies, but the originals will seal the case. As afternoon faded to evening, Clara found herself sitting beside Jonah's pallet. He was sleeping, the laudanum the medic had given him finally taking effect. His face, usually so guarded and stern, looked younger in sleep, the lines of pain and loss temporarily smoothed away. He's a good man, Parker said, settling beside her with a groan. Broken, perhaps, but good. The war did that to many, broke them in ways that don't show on the outside. You knew him before. We crossed paths during the war. I was chaplain with the 14th Wisconsin. Saw him at Shiloh after his brother died. Never seen a man so destroyed yet still standing. Then again at Willow Creek after we found what was left. Parker trailed off, lost in dark memories. Tell me about her. Mary. Parker smiled sadly. She was a teacher like you want to be. Came from Boston, originally full of ideals about bringing education to the frontier. She and Jonah met at a church social in Independence. He was so tongue-tied he could barely speak to her at first. Samuel had to literally push him across the room. Claire could picture it, a younger Jonah, awkward and earnest, trying to court an educated Eastern woman. She loved him deeply. They were to be married after his enlistment ended. She was staying with her aunt in Willow Creek, safer than Independence, or so they thought. Parker's expression darkened. Hale's raiders hit the town on a Sunday morning, claimed they were looking for bushwhackers, Union guerrillas. When the townspeople denied harboring any, Hale decided to make an example. The church burning. 37 people. Mary was helping with Sunday school, teaching the youngest children. When the doors were barred and the fire started, Parker stopped shaking his head. Jonah was 2 days away with his unit. By the time they arrived, there was nothing left but charred timbers and bones. Clara felt tears on her cheeks. She understood now why Jonah had saved her, why he'd risked everything.
It wasn't just about her, it was about all the people he hadn't been able to save. He blamed himself, she said. It wasn't a question. Of course he did. That's what good men do, carry guilt for things beyond their control. He mustered out after the war ended and disappeared into the territories. I heard rumors over the years that he was hunting Hale, that he'd become a hermit, that he'd died. Finding him in that cabin still breathing but not really living, it broke my heart. And now, Parker looked at her meaningfully. Now he has a reason to live again. Don't waste that gift, Miss Whitmore. That night, Clara kept vigil beside Jonah despite her own pain and exhaustion. The medic had given her laudanum too, but she refused to take it, wanting to stay alert. The mission was full of soldiers, now secure, but old habits died hard. She'd spent too many nights afraid to relax easily into safety. Jonah woke near midnight disoriented and reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Clara caught his hand holding it until recognition dawned in his eyes. "You're safe," she said softly. "We're at the mission. It's over." He studied her face in the candlelight. "You look terrible." "Charming. You certainly know how to compliment a lady." "I mean, you need rest. Your wound is fine. The medic stitched it properly. I'll have an interesting scar, but I'll heal." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Jonah said, "You killed him." "Yes." "How do you feel about that?" Clara considered the question. "I thought I'd feel guilty, or satisfied, or something, but mostly I just feel empty, like I'm waiting for something that isn't coming." "The waiting is for yourself," Jonah said quietly. "For the person you'll become now that you're free to choose. That's what I've been doing for 10 years, waiting instead of choosing. And now," he squeezed her hand, "now I think maybe it's time to stop waiting." Morrison approached them in the morning, looking official despite the dust still coating his uniform. "Judge Harrison has arrived. He wants to take statements from both of you. Also, Mr. Carver, there's the matter of your appointment. The marshal position is yours if you want it. The territory needs men like you men who understand justice and won't be bought." Jonah looked at Clara, a question in his eyes. She understood what he was asking. Would she stay if he took the position, or would she disappear into her own future? "The territory also needs teachers," she said carefully. "Schools. Places where children can learn to be better than their parents. Fort Grant has been trying to establish a school for the soldiers' children," Morrison mentioned. "The commander's wife has been particularly vocal about it. I'm sure they'd welcome an educated woman with your determination." Before either could respond, Parker appeared with a strange expression on his face. "Miss Whitmore, there's someone here to see you." Clara tensed, but Parker quickly added, "It's your father." Samuel Whitmore stood in the courtyard, hat literally in hand, looking like he'd aged a decade in the past few days. His clothes were clean but worn, his face gaunt with guilt and worry. When he saw Clara, tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Clara, my girl, I'm so sorry, so desperately sorry." She stood frozen, a war of emotions playing across her face. Jonah struggled to his feet, despite the medic's protests, standing beside her in silent support. "You sold me," Clara said, her voice flat, like livestock. "I know. God help me, I know. I was drunk, desperate, and Hale, he knew exactly what to say, what to promise, but when I sobered up, when I realized what I'd done..." He pulled out a flask, then seemed to think better of it, throwing it away into the desert. "That's done. The drinking, the gambling, all of it. I know it doesn't fix anything, but..." "You're right," Clara interrupted. "It doesn't fix anything." Her father's shoulders slumped further. "I know. I just wanted to see that you were alive, that you were safe. And to give you this." He held out an envelope. "It's the deed to your mother's family land in Colorado. The one thing I never gambled away because it was in your name. It's not much, just 40 acres near Denver, but it's yours. Somewhere to start over away from all this." Clara took the envelope with trembling hands. Her mother had always talked about that land, dreaming of building a proper home there someday. "Why didn't you ever tell me about this?" "Because I was afraid if you knew you had options, you'd leave, and I'd be alone with my failures." He looked at Jonah. "You're the man who saved her." She saved herself," Jonah replied. I just helped a little. Samuel Whitmore studied Jonah for a long moment, taking in the marshal's badge Morrison had pinned to his shirt, the protective way he stood beside Clara despite his injury. Take care of her, he said simply. She doesn't need taking care of. She needs respect, support, and the freedom to choose her own path. Samuel nodded slowly. You're right. I never understood that. He turned back to Clara. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But know that I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to be the father I should have been. He turned to leave, but Clara's voice stopped him. Father, he turned back, hope flickering in his eyes. Thank you for the land papers, and for getting Hale's documents to Reverend Parker. That helped. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. Samuel nodded, put on his hat, and walked away into the desert morning. Clara stood watching him go, tears running silently down her cheeks. Jonah put his arm around her shoulders, offering comfort without words. Family is complicated, Parker observed, joining them. The good Lord knows that better than anyone. Look at Cain and Abel. Some things can't be fixed, Clara said. No, Parker agreed. But sometimes broken things can still function just differently than originally intended. Judge Harrison arrived that afternoon, a stern man with silver hair and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see through any deception. He took statements from everyone involved, his secretary carefully recording every detail. When he examined Hale's journal, his expression grew increasingly grim. This is damning, he said finally, not just for Hale, but for a dozen other men currently holding positions of power. This will trigger a federal investigation that could reshape the entire territory. Good, Jonah said firmly. Harrison studied him. You realize you'll be making enemies. Powerful men don't fall without trying to take others with them. I've been living with enemies for 10 years, Judge. At least now I'll be facing them in the open. That's why Grant wants you as a marshal. We need men who aren't afraid of the fight that's coming. Harrison turned to Clara. Your testimony will be crucial, Miss Whitmore. Are you prepared for that? I've already been shot, hunted, and nearly burned alive, Clara said. A courtroom doesn't scare me. Harrison actually smiled at that. I believe you'll do well on the stand. Over the next several days, as Jonah and Clara recovered from their wounds, the mission became a hub of activity. Federal troops arrived to arrest men named in Hale's journal. The territorial government went into upheaval as corrupt officials were removed. And through it all, the evidence that Clara's father had stolen and Clara and Jonah had protected became the cornerstone of a cleansing that the territory had long needed. Robert Downs, the undertaker who'd fought beside them, approached Clara one evening as she sat watching the sunset from the mission walls. Strange few days, he said, settling beside her with the careful movements of a man whose profession required respectful stillness. That's an understatement. I wanted to thank you. All these years I've been burying Hale's victims, knowing what he was, but too afraid to do anything about it. You showed me that fear isn't an excuse for inaction. I was terrified the entire time, Clara admitted. But you acted anyway. That's courage, Miss Whitmore. Real courage. As he left, Clara reflected on how many lives had been changed by these events. Tom Martinez was already making plans to reclaim his family's land. The Grayson brothers were heading to the federal court to challenge the forged documents that had stolen their ranch. Ben Cooper had been offered a position as a deputy marshal under Jonah, a chance to help enforce real law rather than Hale's version of it. And what about her? What came next for Clara Whitmore? She found Jonah in the chapel, studying a map spread across a makeshift table. He looked up as she entered, and she was pleased to see color returning to his face, strength returning to his movements. Planning your marshalling territory, she asked, trying to understand what I've gotten myself into. The district covers 300 square miles, includes 4 towns, and God knows how many ranches and mines. Harrison says I'll need at least 3 deputies to start. Ben Cooper's a good choice. Already accepted. I'm thinking of asking the Grayson brothers too once they get their land situation sorted. Clara traced a finger along the map, stopping at Fort Grant. The school Morrison mentioned. I've been thinking about it. And it's a start, but I want more. A proper school, not just for soldiers' children, but for anyone who wants to learn. The territory is going to grow now that Hale's corruption is being cleaned out. There will be families, communities. They'll need education. That sounds like a big dream. You killed a monster and brought down a conspiracy that reached to the territorial capital. I think big dreams are allowed. Jonah stood moving carefully to avoid pulling his stitches. He faced her, and Clara could see him struggling with words, this man who could face down killers but fumbled with emotions. Clara, He stopped, started again. When you were shot when I thought I might lose you, I realized something. For 10 years, I've been dead inside just going through the motions. But these past days with you, he took a breath. I know we've only known each other a short time and under terrible circumstances, but Clara stopped him with a finger to his lips. Jonah Carver, are you trying to court me? I suppose I am, though I'm probably doing it badly. You're doing fine, but if we're going to do this, we do it properly. I won't be any man's property, not ever again. I won't be owned or controlled or made less than I am. I wouldn't want you any other way. You're fierce and brave and stubborn as a mule. Careful with the compliments there, Marshal. And I love all of it. I love that you stood up to Hale, that you fought beside me, that you refused to be broken by what you've been through. The word hung between them. Love. It seemed impossible after such a short time through such violence, but Clara felt it too, a connection forged in fire and tested in blood. I have that land in Colorado, she said carefully. 40 acres near Denver. It could be a good place for a school. And Denver's growing, they'll need federal marshals there too. Is that a proposal, Miss Whitmore? It's a suggestion, Marshal Carver. A possibility. But first I need time. Time to heal, to find out who I am when I'm not running or fighting or surviving. Can you give me that? I've waited 10 years to feel alive again. I can wait a little longer for you to be ready. She kissed him, then soft and careful because of their wounds, but with a promise of more to come. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. Parker married them 6 months later in a small ceremony in Denver. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress carefully preserved and nothing like the blood-stained satin she'd fled in that terrible night. Jonah wore his marshal's badge on a new black suit. Ben Cooper stood as best man while Mrs. Morrison, the commander's wife, who'd become Clara's dear friend, served as matron of honor. The school Clara founded started with 12 students in a converted barn. Within 2 years, it had its own building and 3 teachers. She taught reading and arithmetic, but also courage and justice lessons learned in blood, but passed on in hope. Jonah served as a federal marshal for 15 years, becoming known for his fairness and his refusal to be corrupted. He and Ben Cooper broke up 3 more conspiracies like Hale's, earning the respect of honest citizens and the fear of those who preferred the old ways. They had 3 children, Samuel after Jonah's brother, Mary after his lost love Clara insisted, saying the past should be honored, not hidden, and Hope because that's what they'd found in each other. On quiet evenings, sitting on the porch of their Denver home, they would sometimes speak of that night in the desert, of the mission siege of the mine, where everything ended and began. The scars on their bodies had faded to silver lines, reminders of survival rather than sources of pain. Do you ever regret it? Clara asked one such evening 20 years later. The violence, the killing. I regret that it was necessary, Jonah replied, his arm around her shoulders. But not that we did it. Some fights you don't walk away from. Even knowing the cost. He turned to look at her. This woman who'd transformed from a desperate runaway bride into a pillar of their community, who'd built schools and shaped young minds, who'd given him a life worth living. Especially knowing the cost, because now I know the value of what we were fighting for. Their eldest son Samuel came out onto the porch, a young man now wearing the badge of a deputy marshal. "Pa, there's news from the territorial capital. They're talking about statehood again." "About time," Clara said. "This territory has grown up. It's ready to stand on its own." Like we did, she thought, but didn't say. Like 2 broken people who found each other in blood and darkness and chose to build something better from the ashes. As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, Clara thought of that other sunset years ago when she'd stood in Jonah's ruined cabin, wondering if she'd survived the night. She had survived, and more. She'd thrived, loved, built a life of meaning. The girl who'd run barefoot through the desert was gone, replaced by a woman who stood her ground, who fought for justice with words and wisdom rather than guns, though she still kept that Navy Colt in her desk drawer cleaned and loaded just in case. Because some lessons once learned should never be forgotten, and some fights once won must be defended forever. In her school above the blackboard, she'd hung a simple motto: education is freedom, courage is the key. Her students didn't always understand what it meant, these children who'd grown up in relative peace. But she taught them anyway, preparing them for the fights they might one day face, the moments when running would be easier than standing. And sometimes when she told them stories of the old days, carefully edited for young ears, she'd see a spark in someone's eyes, that recognition that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when pushed to their limits. That heroes weren't born but made, forged in moments of choice when backing down would be safer. But standing up was right. Those were the students she watched most carefully, knowing they'd be the ones to carry the torch forward when she and Jonah were gone. The ones who'd face down their own Victor Hales, their own moments of terror and triumph. The West was changing, becoming civilized, tamed. But Clara knew that civilization was always fragile, always threatened by those who would use power to oppress rather than protect. The fight she and Jonah had won was just one battle in an endless war between those who would own others and those who insisted on freedom. But for now, in this moment, with her family around her and peace in the valley, it was enough. They'd earned this happiness with blood and sacrifice, and she'd be damned if she'd let anyone take it from them. The Nevada Colt still sat in her drawer after all, and her aim had only improved with age, and the years of peace hadn't softened Clara's instincts, which was why she noticed the stranger watching her school 3 days before he made his move. He was careful, professional even, but Clara had learned long ago to trust the prickle at the back of her neck that warned of danger. She mentioned it to Jonah that evening as they prepared dinner together, their younger children helping set the table while Samuel was out on patrol. Tall man, thin as a rail, with a scar across his left eyebrow, she said, chopping carrots with precise movements. He's been watching from different positions each day. Yesterday from the mercantile porch, today from the saloon across the street. Jonah's hand stilled over the bread he was slicing. You're certain he's watching the school specifically? He leaves when I dismiss the children, returns when I arrive in the morning. She met his eyes. It feels like that night all over again, Jonah. That feeling of being hunted. Their daughter Mary, now 15 and sharp as her mother, looked up from her studies. Is someone threatening the school, Papa? We don't know yet, Jonah said carefully, but he was already reaching for his gun belt hanging by the door. Could be nothing, but your mother's instincts have kept us alive more than once. Hope, their youngest at 12, moved closer to her sister. She'd heard enough stories over the years to know that her parents' past occasionally reached into their present with dangerous fingers. I'll have Ben take a look tomorrow, Jonah decided. Discreet-like. Meanwhile, you carry the Colt. I always do, Clara reminded him, patting the pocket of her dress where the familiar weight rested. The next morning brought answers, though not the kind they expected. Clara was teaching arithmetic when Ben Cooper entered the schoolhouse, his deputy badge catching the morning light. Behind him stood the thin stranger. Though up close, Clara could see he was younger than she'd thought, perhaps 25, with the haunted look she recognized from too many faces that had survived violence. Mrs. Carver, Ben said formally, this is Thomas Hale. He's asked to speak with you and the marshal. The name hit Clara like a physical blow. Her hand moved instinctively toward her pocket, but she forced herself to remain calm. Her students were watching, sensing the sudden tension. Class San, she said, her voice admirably steady. Please continue with your exercises. Mary, would you supervise? Her daughter nodded, understanding immediately that this was serious. Clara stepped outside with Ben and Thomas Hale, her mind racing. The young man stood with his hands visible, clearly trying to appear non-threatening. You're Victor's son, she said. It wasn't a question. His bastard, Thomas corrected, his voice carrying traces of bitter pride. Born to a saloon girl he favored before he started building his empire. He never acknowledged me publicly, but he made sure I knew who my father was. Made sure I knew what was expected of a Hale. And what brings you here? Clara kept her voice neutral, though every instinct screamed danger. Justice, Thomas said simply. Or maybe revenge. I'm not sure there's much difference anymore. Ben shifted uncomfortably. He says he has information about a group planning to finish what his father started. I thought the marshal should hear it. Clara studied the young man's face, seeing echoes of Victor Hale in the strong jaw and piercing eyes, but also something else, a weariness that spoke of carrying unwanted legacy. Ben, send someone for Jonah. We'll meet at the marshal's office. An hour later, they sat in Jonah's office, the afternoon sun casting long shadows through the barred windows. Thomas Hale sat across from them, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Up close, the resemblance to his father was even more pronounced, though. Where Victor had carried himself with arrogant authority, Thomas seemed burdened by invisible weights. Start from the beginning, Jonah said, his voice carefully controlled. Clara knew he was fighting every instinct that told him to arrest or shoot anyone named Hale. Thomas took a breath. After my father died, after you killed him, he looked at Clara without accusation. His associates scattered. Most fled the territory, but some went underground. They've been planning organizing, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what they see as theirs. And you know this how? Jonah asked. Because they approached me 6 months ago. Thought the bastard's son would want revenge for his father's death. They offered me a place in their new order, a chance to restore the Hale name. He laughed bitterly. As if that name was anything but poison. What do they want? Clara asked. Everything. The land, the power, the fear. There's a man, Jonathan Cross, who was my father's silent partner in several ventures. He's gathered the remnants of my father's network. They call themselves the Restoration Committee, like they're some kind of legitimate political movement. Jonah exchanged a glance with Clara. They'd heard rumors of organizing among the old guard, but nothing concrete until now. They're planning something specific, Thomas continued. That's why I'm here. They want to make an example like my father did at Willow Creek, show that the federal government can't protect everyone. The school? Clara breathed understanding flooding through her. Thomas nodded. Next week during the Founders' Day celebration, when all the families will be gathered, they plan to take hostages, demand the release of associates currently in federal prison, and... He trailed off. And Jonah prompted, though his face suggested he already knew. And execute you both publicly. Make an example of what happens to those who stand against them. The office fell silent, except for the tick of the clock on the wall. Clara felt that familiar cold settle in her stomach, the same feeling from 20 years ago when she'd heard the hounds baying in the desert night. How many men? Jonah asked, already shifting into tactical planning. 20, maybe 25. All experienced fighters, several ex-Confederate guerrillas who've been living rough in Mexico. Cross has been recruiting for months, promising them land and pardons once he has leverage over the government. And you're telling us this why? Clara asked. What do you gain? Thomas met her eyes directly. Redemption, maybe. Or just an end to the nightmares. I've spent my whole life carrying my father's sins. Every crime he committed, every life he destroyed, it's all on me too, just because I carry his blood. I want it to end. I want the Hale name to die with this generation. You could have just disappeared, Jonah pointed out. Changed your name, started over somewhere else. I tried that. Went to California for 3 years, worked on the docks under a false name. But the past has a way of finding you. Someone always recognizes the resemblance, puts together the connections. And the nightmares. He shuddered. Did you know he made me watch? When I was 15, he made me watch him torture a man who'd crossed him. Said it would make me strong, teach me how the world really worked. Clara saw Jonah's jaw tighten. They both understood how violence could mark a child's soul. What are you proposing? She asked. I help you stop them. I know their plans, their faces, their weaknesses. In exchange, Thomas hesitated. In exchange, I want you to tell the truth about me. That Victor Hale's son chose justice over blood. That the sins of the father don't have to poison the son forever. Ben Cooper, who'd been silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke. Could be a trap marshal. Get us to lower our guard, bunch us all together for the slaughter. It could, Jonah agreed. But my gut says it isn't. He studied Thomas carefully. You look like him, but you don't carry yourself like him. Your father walked into a room expecting everyone to bow. You walk in expecting judgment. I've been judged my whole life for something I had no control over, Thomas said quietly. Just once I'd like to be judged for my own actions. Clara made a decision. We accept your help, but you'll be watched.
One false move, one sign of betrayal, and I'll put a bullet in you myself. I've done it before to a Hale, and I won't hesitate to do it again." Thomas nodded, seeming almost relieved by the threat. "Understood." Over the next 3 days, they worked in secret to prepare. Thomas provided detailed intelligence about Cross's men, their weapons, their planned approach routes. The Founders' Day celebration couldn't be canceled without raising suspicion, so instead they planned a trap of their own. Jonah quietly brought in additional deputies from neighboring jurisdictions, men he trusted who owed no allegiance to the old networks. They arrived in small groups posing as travelers or laborers, taking positions around the town. Clara, meanwhile, worked with the school's older students, teaching them emergency procedures without revealing the specific threat. If you hear the church bell ring 3 times in rapid succession, she told them, keeping her voice calm and instructional, "You are to immediately lead the younger children to the root cellar beneath the school. Bar the door, and don't come out until either Marshal Carver or I come for you personally." Mary pulled her aside after the lesson. "It's happening again, isn't it? The violence from your past." Clara wanted to lie to protect her daughter from the harsh realities, but Mary had inherited too much of her parents' steel to be fooled. "Yes, but we're ready this time. We're not running. We're not reacting. We're choosing the battlefield. I want to help." "You will help by keeping the younger children safe. That's not a small thing, Mary. It's perhaps the most important thing." The night before Founders' Day, Clara couldn't sleep. She stood at their bedroom window looking out at the peaceful town that had become their home. Jonah came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Scared?" he asked. "Terrified," she admitted. "But not for myself, for them. For our children, our students, this life we've built. We faced worse odds. We were younger then, and we had less to lose." Jonah turned her to face him. "We also had less to fight for. This town, these people, they're worth protecting, and we're not alone this time." A soft knock at their door interrupted them. Hope stood in the doorway, her young face serious. "I can't sleep either. Will you tell me about that night, the real story? Not the one you tell when you think I'm listening?" They sat on Hope's bed, and Clara told her youngest daughter the truth about the fear, the blood, the desperate flight through the desert, about choosing to stand when running would have been easier. Hope listened with wide eyes, occasionally reaching out to touch the thin scar on her mother's side where the bullet had passed through. "Were you ever sorry," Hope asked, "that you didn't just run far away where Hale couldn't find you?" "Never," Clara said firmly. "Running would have kept me alive, but standing and fighting let me live. There's a difference." The morning of Founders' Day dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect Colorado day that made the mountains seem to glow. The town square filled with families setting up tables for the communal meal, children running between the booths, musicians tuning their instruments for the afternoon's dancing. Clara stood near the school greeting families as they arrived, the Navy Colt, a familiar weight in her pocket. Her eyes constantly scanned the crowd, looking for faces that didn't belong. Thomas Hale stood near the livery stable, ostensibly helping with horses, but actually watching the southern approach to town. The attack came at noon, just as Thomas had predicted. They came in 3 groups, moving with military precision. The first group, 6 men, approached from the south, walking openly down Main Street like legitimate visitors. The second came from the east, using the cover of the wagon traffic from the mining camps. The third, including Cross himself, circled to approach the school from behind. But Jonah's deputies were ready. The church bell rang 3 times in rapid succession. Clara watched with pride as her older students immediately began herding the younger ones towards safety. No panic, just swift, efficient movement. Mary caught her eye and nodded once before disappearing into the cellar with the children. The first shots came from the eastern group, who'd realized they'd walked into a trap, when Ben Cooper and 3 deputies emerged from concealment with weapons drawn. The peaceful Founders' Day celebration erupted into chaos as families scattered for cover. Clara found herself facing 2 men who'd broken through the perimeter, heading straight for the school. She recognized one from Thomas's descriptions, Carl Brennan, a former Confederate raider with 17 confirmed kills. "Mrs. Carver," Brennan said with mock politeness, touching his hat brim. "Mr. Cross sends his regards." Clara drew the Navy Colt in one smooth motion, muscle memory from 20 years ago, still perfect. "Tell him yourself when you see him in hell."
Brennan went for his gun fast for a man his age, but Clara was faster. The Colt barked twice and Brennan stumbled backward, surprise replacing arrogance on his face. The second man froze, hands half raised toward his weapon. "You can draw and die, or you can surrender," Clara said calmly. "Choose quickly." The man chose surrender, dropping his gun and raising his hands fully. Around them, the battle raged. Jonah's voice rang out above the gunfire, directing his deputies with the same calm authority he'd shown at the mission 20 years ago. Clara secured her prisoner and moved toward the main conflict, keeping low, using the scattered wagons and booths for cover. She could see Cross himself near the church, a tall man with prematurely white hair and the bearing of someone used to command. He was shouting orders, trying to rally his scattered forces. Then she saw Thomas Hale emerge from behind the church, gun drawn. For a moment, Clara's heart stopped. Had it been a trap after all? But Thomas's gun was pointed at Cross, not at the defenders. "Jonathan Cross!" Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the square. "This ends now!" Cross turned his face, contorting with rage when he saw Thomas. "You traitorous whelp! You dare stand against your father's legacy!" "My father's legacy is death and misery," Thomas replied. "I choose a different path." Cross drew his weapon with lightning speed, but Thomas was ready. Both men fired simultaneously. Cross's shot went wide while Thomas's found its mark. Cross fell to his knees, blood spreading across his white shirt. Thomas walked closer, keeping his gun trained on the fallen man. "This is for every child who grew up in the shadow of their parents' crimes," he said. "The sins of the fathers die today." Cross tried to speak, blood bubbling from his lips, then collapsed forward and was still. The death of their leader broke the remaining attackers' resolve. Some surrendered, others tried to flee, only to be caught by Jonah's perimeter of deputies. Within 20 minutes of the first shot, it was over. Clara found Jonah in the square, a cut on his cheek, but otherwise unharmed. They embraced briefly, professionally aware that the town was watching. Then she went to the school and called the all-clear. The children emerged from the cellar, Hope and Mary shepherding them with calm efficiency. "Everyone accounted for?" Clara asked. "Every single one," Mary reported proudly. "We did just like you taught us." As the federal marshals arrived to take custody of the prisoners, Clara noticed Thomas Hale sitting alone on the church steps, his father's gun loose in his hands. She approached carefully, sitting beside him without speaking at first. "I thought killing him would make me feel free," Thomas said eventually. "But I just feel empty." "Freedom isn't a feeling," Clara told him. "It's a choice you make every day. You chose to stand with justice today. Tomorrow you'll choose again. Eventually, the choosing gets easier." Does the past ever really let go? Clara thought of her own father, of the letter she'd received last month saying he'd died peacefully in his sleep, sober for the last 5 years of his life. She thought of the nightmares that still sometimes woke her, of the scar on her side that ached when storms approached. "No," she said honestly, "but you learn to carry it differently, like a bag of stones that gets lighter the farther you walk from where you picked them up." The aftermath of the Founders' Day attack brought unexpected consequences. The federal government, embarrassed that such a conspiracy had formed under their watch, increased funding for law enforcement in the territory. Jonah was promoted to chief marshal, overseeing a network of deputies across 3 states. Thomas Hale surprised everyone by requesting to join the marshal's service. After extensive vetting and against considerable opposition, he was accepted as a deputy under Ben Cooper's direct supervision. He proved to be dedicated and incorruptible, though he would always carry the burden of his name. Clara's school gained national attention when a journalist from Harper's Weekly wrote about the teacher who'd fought off attackers to protect her students. Donations poured in, allowing her to expand the school and hire additional teachers. She established a scholarship fund for children who'd lost parents to violence, understanding too well how loss could derail a young life's potential. Years passed. Samuel became a federal judge, carrying on his parents' commitment to justice through law rather than violence. Mary opened her own school in Denver, revolutionary in its approach to educating girls in sciences and mathematics alongside traditional subjects. Hope became a writer chronicling the transformation of the West, from lawless frontier to civilized territory, though she never forgot the wildness that had shaped it. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Jonah and Clara returned to the old mission where they'd made their stand against Victor Hale. It had been restored as a historical monument with a plaque commemorating the battle. They stood in the courtyard remembering that desperate night when 7 people had held off 50. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd just kept riding that night?" Clara asked. "If you'd never opened your door?" Jonah pulled her close. "Every choice we make closes off 1,000 other possibilities. But I've never regretted opening that door. It brought me back to life. Even with all the violence that followed. Because of what followed, we stood against evil Clara. We won. And then we built something good from the ashes." How many people can say that? As they rode back toward Denver, Clara reflected on the strange paths life could take. She'd begun as a gambler's daughter, sold like property to settle a debt. She'd become a runaway bride, a fighter, a killer when necessary. But ultimately, she'd transformed into what she'd always dreamed of being: a teacher, a mother, a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The West had been won not through single dramatic battles, but through thousands of small choices made by ordinary people to stand against wrong, to protect the innocent, to build rather than destroy. She and Jonah had played their part in that transformation, and their children would continue the work. That evening, as they sat on their porch in Denver, Clara noticed a young woman approaching their gate hesitantly. She was perhaps 17, with the lean, hungry look of someone who'd been running. Her dress was torn, and there were bruises on her arms. "Mrs. Carver?" the girl asked. I heard you help people, women who need to escape." Clara stood seeing herself 25 years ago in this girl's frightened but determined eyes. "Come inside, child. You're safe now." As she led the girl into their home, Jonah preparing tea without being asked, Clara realized that some fights never really ended. They just passed from one generation to the next, transformed, but essentially the same: the eternal struggle between those who would own others and those who insisted on freedom. But that was all right. She had faced down worse than whatever pursued this girl, and she had taught dozens of young people to do the same. The Navy Colt still sat in her desk drawer, but these days she fought with different weapons: education law and the quiet strength of example. Still, as she helped the girl clean her wounds and heard her story of escape from an arranged marriage to a brutal man, Clara touched the pocket where she'd once carried that gun. Some lessons bore repeating, and some fights were worth having again and again until the world finally learned. The girl's name was Catherine, and she'd run from a ranch near the New Mexico border where her stepfather had promised her to his creditor. The parallels to Clara's own story were unmistakable, though the world had changed enough that Catherine had known to seek help rather than simply run. "He'll come for me," Catherine said, echoing words Clara had spoken decades ago. "Let him come," Clara replied, and her tone carried the weight of every battle she'd fought and won. "We've dealt with his kind before." Jonah looked up from where he was loading his rifle, a small smile playing at his lips. 25 years of marriage, and she still thinks she can handle everything with that Navy Colt. "It's worked so far," Clara shot back, but she was smiling too. They set Catherine up in Mary's old room, and Clara sent word to her network. Yes, she had a network now: teachers and lawmen and ordinary citizens who watched for women in danger and provided safe passage when needed. By morning, Catherine would have new clothes, traveling papers, and a teaching position waiting for her in San Francisco if she wanted it. "Why do you do this?" Catherine asked, as Clara tucked her in like she was one of her own daughters. "Because someone did it for me once, and because every woman who escapes and thrives proves that we're more than property, more than bargaining chips in men's games." That night, lying beside Jonah, Clara thought about cycles and patterns, about how the same fights kept returning in different forms. But she also thought about progress, slow, sometimes barely visible, but real. Her daughters would never face what she had faced. Her students would know their rights and their worth. The world was changing. One rescued girl, one educated child, one stood ground at a time. "You're thinking loud again," Jonah murmured in the darkness, "just remembering and planning. The two most dangerous activities you engage in." She elbowed him gently. "Someone has to. You'd be content to just arrest the bad men and call it done, while you want to change the world that creates them. Is that so wrong?" He turned to face her, and even in the darkness she could feel the warmth of his smile. "No, It's one of the 1,000 reasons I love you. You don't just fight battles, you work to prevent the next war. A week later, Catherine's stepfather arrived with 3 hired men exactly as Clara had predicted. But he found not a frightened girl alone, but a united front of law and community. Jonah arrested him for attempted kidnapping, and the federal prosecutor Samuel Carver, following in his father's footsteps, made sure the charges stuck. Catherine stayed to testify, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. Afterward, she chose not to go to San Francisco, but to stay and help Clara at the school. "Someone help me," she said simply. "I should help others." And so it continued the long work of transformation. Clara's hair grew gray then white, but her eyes remained sharp and her aim true. The Navy Colt moved from her pocket to a place of honor on the wall, but everyone knew she could still use it if needed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late autumn when the aspens had turned gold and the first snow dusted the peaks surrounding Denver. Clara was in her study reviewing lesson plans with Catherine when Jonah entered with an expression she hadn't seen in years, the careful mask he wore when violence threatened their carefully constructed peace. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her pen. He handed her the letter wordlessly. The paper was expensive, the handwriting cultured and precise. As she read, her blood gradually turned to ice. "My dear Mrs. Carver," it began. "You don't know me, but I knew your late husband-in-law quite well. Victor Hale was my cousin, and while I did not approve of all his methods, I find myself compelled by family honor to address certain outstanding matters. You took from him not just his life, but his legacy. It seems only fair that you should lose something equally precious. Consider this a courtesy. You have 3 days to put your affairs in order. I am not the monster Victor was. I will make it quick. Sincerely, Margaret Hale Thornton." Catherine read over Clara's shoulder, gasping softly. "She's threatening to kill you." "No," Jonah said grimly. "She's declaring war. Margaret Hale married into the Thornton Railroad family 15 years ago. She has more money than God and connections throughout the government. If she's finally decided to move against us, then we fight," Clara said simply, though her hand trembled slightly as she set down the letter. "We've done it before. We were younger before, and this isn't some frontier desperado with a gang of thugs. Margaret Thornton owns judges, senators, entire towns. She could destroy us legally, financially, without ever firing a shot." A knock at the door interrupted them. Ben Cooper entered, his face grave despite the silver that now dominated his once dark hair. "Marshal, we have a problem. 3 federal judges just issued warrants for your arrest. Corruption, abuse of power, and murder in the case of Victor Hale." "That's impossible," Clara protested. "That was ruled self-defense 25 years ago." "New evidence has allegedly surfaced," Ben said bitterly. "A witness who claims you shot Hale after he'd surrendered. The judges issuing these warrants all received substantial campaign contributions from Thornton Industries last year." Clara felt the walls of their carefully built life beginning to crack. This was different from the physical threats they'd faced before. This was the system itself being turned against them. "There's more," Ben continued reluctantly. "The school's charter is being challenged. Some obscure violation about the proper filing of incorporation papers. And Jonah, your federal appointment is under review. They're saying you lied about your military service, that you were actually court-martialed for shooting Confederate prisoners." "That's a complete fabrication," Jonah said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Of course it is. But proving that will take time, lawyers' money. Meanwhile, they can freeze your assets, close the school, destroy your reputations." Clara stood slowly, moving to the window where she could see her students playing in the schoolyard during their morning break. Mary's daughter among them, a bright girl of 10 who had her grandmother's fierce intelligence. "She wants us to run, to abandon everything and everyone we've protected." "Maybe we should," Catherine said quietly. "You've fought enough battles. You've earned peace." "Peace isn't earned," Clara replied. "It's defended, every day in small ways and large." She turned from the window and Jonah saw the familiar steel in her green eyes. "Margaret Thornton thinks she can win this with money and connections, but she's forgotten something important." "What's that?" Ben asked. "We didn't survive Victor Hale by fighting fair." That evening they gathered their allies in the school's main room. The space that usually rang with children's voices now held a council of war. Samuel had arrived from the federal courthouse, his judge's robes replaced with traveling clothes. Mary came from her school with her husband, a newspaper editor named James, who'd courted her for 3 years before she'd agreed to marry him. Hope brought her notebook and her sharp wit ready to document whatever came next. Thomas Hale was there too, his deputy's badge gleaming in the lamplight, his presence a reminder that blood didn't determine destiny. Margaret Thornton has been planning this for years. Samuel began spreading documents across Clara's teaching desk. I've been investigating since Ben's warning arrived. She's acquired interests in banks that hold mortgages throughout the county. She owns the railroad that supplies the town. She's even bought the company that provides textbooks to the schools.
A web, Hope observed, making notes. She's spun a web around us without us noticing. The question is, what does she really want? Mary asked. If it was just revenge, she could have hired assassins. This is about something more. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. May I? When Jonah nodded, he continued. Margaret Hale Thornton isn't just Victor's cousin. She was his confidant, possibly the only person he actually trusted. Before he came to Arizona, they were close. Some say lovers, though they were cousins. Charming family, Clara muttered. She has all his other papers, Thomas continued. The ones you didn't find. Records of where he hid his wealth accounts in banks from here to San Francisco. But she needs something you have to access them. The journal, Jonah realized. There must be something in Victor's journal we missed, some code or key. Clara retrieved the journal from the safe where it had been kept as evidence. They'd read it so many times during the trials that followed Hale's death, but always focusing on his crimes, not his finances. Now under lamplight, with fresh eyes, Hope found it. Here, she said, pointing to what looked like marginalia. These numbers in the borders. I thought they were dates, but they're not. They're account numbers. And these Latin phrases, they're not really Latin. They're corrupted intentionally. They're passwords. Victor's fortune, Thomas breathed. The money he stole, extorted, murdered for, it's all here hidden in plain sight. And Margaret needs this to claim it, Samuel added. Without the journal, those accounts will remain frozen forever. The banks require both the account numbers and the original documentation. So we have leverage, James said, his editor's mind already working. She needs something we have. But she's already destroyed our lives, Catherine pointed out. These warrants the challenges to the school. Only if we let them stand, Clara said. She'd been quiet, thinking, planning. Now she stood and everyone turned to her instinctively. 25 years of leadership had given her an authority that needed no badge or title. Margaret Thornton has forgotten that we're not civilized people playing at frontier life. We're survivors who learn to use civilization as a tool. She looked at each of them in turn. Samuel, how long before these warrants become active? 72 hours. They have to be registered with the federal system. Hope your publisher in New York, the one who's been wanting your memoir about the transformation of the West, is he still interested about? Desperately, he sends letters monthly. Tell him you'll give him the exclusive story of Victor Hale's hidden fortune and his cousin's corruption, but only if he can guarantee publication within the week. Hope's eyes widened. That's impossible. Books take months to publish. Not newspaper serializations, and not when the story involves some of the most powerful people in the country. Clara turned to Thomas. You said Margaret is in Denver. At the Brown Palace Hotel. She arrived yesterday with a small army of lawyers and bodyguards. Then we pay her a visit, tonight. Clara, Jonah warned, that's walking into the lion's den. No, she corrected. That's showing the lion that we have teeth too. They prepared carefully. Clara wore her best dress, the dark blue one she saved for court appearances, with the navy colt concealed in a specially sewn pocket. Jonah wore his marshal's uniform, every medal and commendation displayed. They were accompanied by Samuel in his judge's robes and Hope with her press credentials visible. The Brown Palace Hotel was Denver's finest, all marble and crystal, and barely contained wealth. Margaret Hale Thornton had taken the entire top floor, her guards stationed at the elevators and stairwells. But a federal judge and marshal still commanded respect even from hired muscle. They found Margaret in the penthouse suite's parlor, a woman of perhaps 50 with steel gray hair and Victor's sharp features softened only slightly by femininity. She was beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, elegant, precise, and dangerous. Clara Whitmore Carver,
she said, setting down her teacup. You're smaller than I expected. Victor's journal made you sound like some kind of Amazon. Appearances can be deceiving, Clara replied evenly. As you're about to learn. Margaret's smile was cold. You think you can threaten me? I own half the judges in this state. Your son's career, your daughter's schools, your husband's position, I can destroy it all with a word. You can, Clara agreed, and we can publish Victor's journal in its entirety, including the parts about your relationship with him. For the first time, Margaret's composure cracked slightly. You're bluffing. Oh, Hope pulled out a notebook reading aloud. March 15th, 1867. M visited again last night. The things she suggests would make the devil himself blush, but her mind for business is sharper than any man's. If we weren't blood, she looked up. Shall I continue? It gets quite specific. Margaret's face had gone pale, then flushed red. You wouldn't dare. The scandal would destroy you, Jonah finished. Your husband's family would disown you. Your railroad empire would crumble. Every enemy you've made would circle like vultures. What do you want? Margaret asked through clenched teeth. Clara moved to the window looking out over the city lights. I want what I've always wanted, to be left in peace to live my life and teach my students. You want Victor's account numbers? Fine. Take them. Take his blood money and choke on it. But you withdraw all charges, all challenges, all threats, and you never darken our door again. That's simple. Nothing about this is simple. Clara turned back to face her. You loved him, didn't you, Victor? Despite everything, you loved him. Margaret's composure finally shattered completely. He was brilliant. Cruel, yes, but brilliant. He saw the world as it really was, not through pretty illusions of morality and justice. He saw the world as something to own, Claire corrected. People as property. That's not clarity, it's sickness. You killed him. I defended myself. There's a difference. They stared at each other across the elegant room, two women whose lives had been shaped by the same man's evil in very different ways. Finally, Margaret spoke. The journal for my withdrawal of all legal actions. An assigned agreement never to move against us or ours again. Margaret laughed bitterly. You think a piece of paper will protect you? No, Clara said, her hand moving to rest over the pocket containing the Colt. But it will establish intent if you break it. And then, Mrs. Thornton, you'll learn that I'm much less civilized than these surroundings suggest. The threat hung in the air between them. Margaret might have money and power, but Clara had something more, the willingness to do violence when cornered. It was written in every line of her body, every calm word that carried steel beneath it. Very well, Margaret said finally. She called for her lawyers, who drew up the agreements with suspicious speed. Clearly, they'd anticipated this possibility. As Clara signed her name, Margaret asked, was it worth it? All the blood? All the years of looking over your shoulder? Every second, Clara replied without hesitation. I built a life of meaning. I raised children who make the world better. I educated hundreds of students who went on to become doctors, lawyers, teachers, leaders. What has your money built except walls to hide behind? Margaret had no answer to that. As they left the hotel, Hope asked, will she keep her word? For now, Jonah said, but we'll need to remain vigilant. So nothing changes, Clara observed with dry humor. We've been vigilant for 25 years. The next morning, Clara stood before her students as if nothing had happened. The warrants had been withdrawn, the challenges dropped. Hope's telegraph to New York had resulted in a response promising to send their best journalist. Immediately, the story of Victor Hale's fortune and Margaret Thornton's connection to him was too sensational to pass up. But as Clara began the day's lesson, she noticed something different in her students' faces. Word had spread as it always did in a small community. Their teacher, the gentlewoman who taught them letters and numbers and how to think for themselves, had faced down one of the most powerful women in the country and won. Mrs. Carver, young Elizabeth Mary's daughter, raised her hand. Is it true you scared Mrs. Thornton so bad she nearly fainted? Clara suppressed a smile. Where did you hear that? My papa said you walked into her hotel room like you were going to war and came out with her complete surrender. Your papa has a gift for exaggeration. But Elizabeth, what do you think is the lesson here? The girl considered carefully. That being rich doesn't mean you always win. That's part of it. What else? Another student, a boy named Marcus, whose family had fled persecution in the South, raised his hand. That standing up for what's right is important, even when the other person has more power. Better. Anyone else? Catherine, who'd been observing from the back of the room, spoke up. That sometimes the battles we fight aren't for ourselves, but for the right to exist peacefully. Excellent, Clara said. Now let's talk about the Revolutionary War and how a small group of colonists stood up to the British Empire. The lesson continued, but Clara's mind wandered briefly to the weight of the Navy Colt now returned to her desk drawer. She'd carried it hidden for one last confrontation, ready to use it if necessary. But the real weapon had been the life she'd built, the connection she'd fostered, the truth she was willing to tell. That afternoon, Thomas Hale came to the school. He looked tired, older than his years, but there was a peace in his expression Clara hadn't seen before. "She's leaving," he reported. "Margaret. Her train departs this evening. She had me followed probably to see if I'd betray you to her." He smiled grimly. "She offered me a fortune to turn over any additional documents you might have hidden."
"Were you tempted?" Clara asked. "For about 3 seconds. Then I remembered what you said about choosing freedom every day. I chose it again. It gets easier." "Does it?" "Because every day I wake up and see my father's face in the mirror." Clara studied him with sympathy. "You see his face, but you speak with your own voice. You act with your own conscience. That's what matters." After Thomas left, Clara found Jonah in his study cleaning his rifles, an old habit from the war that he returned to when stressed. "She'll be back," he said without looking up. "Maybe not Margaret specifically, but someone else. There's always someone else." "I know." Clara sat beside him, picking up a cloth to help with the cleaning. "But look what we've built despite that. Samuel's a federal judge. Mary's school has graduated 300 young women who would never have had education otherwise. Hope's writing is changing how people see the West. And you've taught thousands of children to think for themselves." "We've taught them. This was never just my fight, Jonah. From that first night when you opened your door to a desperate stranger, we've been in this together." He set down the rifle and took her hand still strong despite the years. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Victor had just let you go, if he'd written off his loss and moved on? Then some other woman would have suffered instead. Some other family would have been destroyed. The evil wouldn't have ended it, just would have found a different target. So we were inevitable. We were necessary to," Clara corrected. "The world needed someone to stand up to him, and fate chose us." That evening, the whole family gathered for dinner, including Samuel's wife and children, Mary's family, and even Thomas Hale, who'd become an unofficial member of their extended clan. As Clara looked around the table at the faces gathered there, some related by blood, others by choice and circumstance, she thought about the strange paths that had led them all here. "A toast," Hope proposed, raising her glass. "To survival." "To justice," Samuel added. "To education," Mary contributed. "To redemption," Thomas said quietly. "To family," Catherine added, this young woman who'd found shelter and purpose with them. "To choosing to stand," Jonah set his eyes on Clara. Clara raised her own glass, thinking of all the fights they'd won and lost, all the moments of terror and triumph that had brought them to this table. "To tomorrow," she said simply, "and to whatever battles it brings." They drank, and the conversation turned to lighter things. Mary's daughter's piano recital, Samuel's youngest son's fascination with trains, Hope's latest chapter about the changing frontier. But underneath the normal family chatter, Clara sensed the unspoken understanding they all shared. They were warriors in a war that never truly ended, the eternal struggle between those who would dominate and those who insisted on dignity. Later, as Clara prepared for bed, she found a letter that had been slipped under the door during dinner. No signature, but the handwriting was Margaret Thornton's. "You were right," it read. "I loved him despite his evil. Perhaps because of it. You love Jonah despite his goodness, perhaps because of it. We are not so different, you and I, except that you chose to build where I chose to acquire. I will keep our bargain, but know this Victor's legacy doesn't die with my retreat. There are others who remember, others who resent what you've built. Stay vigilant, Clara Carver. The world is full of wolves, and you've shown them that sheep can bite." Clara showed the letter to Jonah, who read it with a frown. "A warning or a threat?" "Both, I think."
but also perhaps a strange form of respect. From one predator to another. No, Clara said firmly. From one survivor to another. Margaret Thornton and I both endured Victor Hale's influence. We just chose different paths afterward. She moved to her desk where the Navy Colt lay in its drawer. On impulse, she took it out, feeling its familiar weight. The metal was well-oiled, still functional despite its age. Like her, she thought with wry humor, aged but still dangerous when necessary. Teaching tomorrow, Jonah asked, watching her handle the weapon with practiced ease. Always. Those children are the real victory, Jonah. Every mind we open, every young person we teach to think and question and stand for themselves, they're the bullets we're firing into the future. That's a violent metaphor for education. Education is violent, Clara said. It destroys ignorance, kills prejudice, murders the comfortable lies people tell themselves. That's why men like Victor Hale fear it so much. She put the Colt back in its drawer, but left the drawer slightly open, accessible if needed. Some habits formed in blood and necessity never fully faded. The next morning brought news that would reshape their understanding of Margaret's visit. Hope burst into the school just as Clara was beginning the day's lessons, newspaper in hand. "She's dead," Hope announced breathlessly. Margaret Thornton. Her train derailed 20 miles outside Denver. She and 3 of her lawyers were killed. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Accident. The paper says so, but Hope hesitated. The engineer survived. He claims he saw someone on the tracks just before the crash, placing something. Jonah arrived minutes later with more information. Federal investigators are already on scene. The rails were definitely sabotaged. Professional job. Who would... Clara began, then stopped. The list of Margaret Thornton's enemies was probably as long as Victor's had been. The account numbers. We gave her the account numbers. Someone else wanted them, Jonah concluded. Someone who knew she was coming here to get them. They looked at each other with growing horror. This wasn't over. It might never be over. Victor Hale's legacy of blood and greed would continue spawning violence until every secret was exposed and every hidden treasure found. "We need protection," Samuel said when he arrived an hour later. "Federal Marshals guards for the school." "No," Clara interrupted. "That's not living, that's just another form of imprisonment. We've never run from a fight and we won't start now." "This is different," Samuel protested. "We don't even know who the enemy is." "We never really have," Clara pointed out. Victor Hale, Jonathan Cross, Margaret Thornton. They were just faces on an ancient evil. Greed power, the desire to own other human beings. That's the real enemy, and it wears 1,000 faces. Over the next weeks, they waited for the next attack, the next threat, the next face of evil to show itself. But nothing came. The investigation into Margaret's death went cold. The account numbers she'd died carrying were never recovered, presumably taken by whoever had orchestrated the crash. Life slowly returned to its rhythm. Clara taught Jonah marshaled their children and grandchildren grew and thrived. But there was a new watchfulness in their days, a recognition that peace was always temporary, always fragile. One evening, as autumn gave way to winter, Clara found herself alone in the schoolhouse after dismissing the students. She was erasing the day's lessons from the board when she heard footsteps behind her. Her hand moved instinctively toward the drawer where the Colt rested. "Don't turn around," a voice said, male, cultured, unfamiliar. "I'm not here to harm you. I simply wanted to see the woman who killed Victor Hale." "That was 25 years ago," Clara said, her hand still near the drawer. Ancient history. History is never ancient to those who live with its consequences. Victor was my mentor. He taught me everything about power, about control, about bending the world to your will. "Then he taught you wrong," the man laughed softly. "Perhaps, or perhaps you simply taught opposition better. Your students, Mrs. Carver. They go out into the world with steel in their spines and questions on their lips. They're harder to control, harder to break." "That's the idea. It's working. The old ways, Victor's ways, they're dying. Not because you killed him, but because you've taught a generation to resist men like him. And you came here to tell me this. I came here to see if you were real. Victor's journal painted you as something between a devil and an angel. But you're just a woman, a teacher. It's almost disappointing. Clara turned then, drawer be damned. The man was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, well-dressed and unremarkable, except for his eyes, which held the same cold intelligence she'd seen in Victor's. The most dangerous people often are disappointing at first glance, she said. Victor taught you that, didn't he? The man smiled. He did. He also taught me to recognize when a war is lost. The world is changing, Mrs. Carver. Your world is winning. I came to see the face of victory. And it looks tired, but determined. Victor would have hated that most of all that you endured. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. There are perhaps a dozen of us left. Victor's protégés scattered across the country. Some will fight your new world. Others, like me, will adapt to it. But all of us will remember that a school teacher brought down an empire with nothing but courage and a Navy Colt. And education, Clara added. Don't forget the education. How could I? It's your most dangerous weapon. After he left, Clara sat at her desk for a long time thinking. She pulled out paper and began to write not a lesson plan, but a letter to her granddaughter Elizabeth. My dear one, she wrote, by the time you read this, I may be gone and the stories of our struggles may seem like ancient history, but I want you to understand that the fight is never truly over. It just changes form. Clara continued writing late into the evening, the lamp casting long shadows across the paper as her pen moved steadily across the page. Evil doesn't announce itself with fangs and claws, my dear Elizabeth. It comes dressed in fine suits and speaks of tradition of the natural order of the way things have always been. Your greatest weapon against it will not be a gun, though you should know how to use one, but your mind questioning, doubting, refusing to accept that might makes right. The sound of urgent hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts. Through the window she saw Thomas Hale riding hard toward the schoolhouse, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cold night air. Clara was at the door before he could knock. They've taken Hope, he gasped, barely able to catch his breath. Armed men, professionals, left this at her house. He handed Clara a telegram, his hands shaking. The message was brief, the daughter for the journal, midnight, Bone Ridge. Come alone or she dies. Clara's blood turned to ice, but her hands remained steady. How long ago? Maybe an hour. James is gathering men, but they'll kill her if we bring a posse. Clara was already moving, gathering what she needed. The Navy Colt from the drawer, extra ammunition, a knife she kept hidden in her boot. Get Jonah. Tell him Bone Ridge, but to stay back unless he hears shooting. You're not actually going alone. I'm going first. There's a difference. She paused at the door, looking back at the letter she'd been writing to Elizabeth. If something happens to me, make sure my granddaughter gets that. Thomas grabbed her arm. This is what they want. You walking into a trap. Yes, Clara agreed. But it's also Hope, my daughter, and I've walked into traps before. The ride to Bone Ridge took her through familiar territory past the old mission, where they'd made their stand against Victor Hale, through canyons that echoed with the ghosts of old battles. The moon was 3/4 full, casting everything in silver and shadow. Clara's mind was clear-focused, running through possibilities and probabilities. Whoever had taken Hope knew their history, knew exactly which pressure point to push. Bone Ridge was a narrow spine of rock jutting up from the desert floor, named for the skeletal remains of some prehistoric beast embedded in its eastern face. It was a natural amphitheater with only one approach, exactly the kind of place someone would choose if they wanted to control a meeting absolutely. Clara stopped her horse a 1/4 mile out, dismounting and tethering the animal to a scrub pine. She'd approach on foot, using the shadows and boulder fields for cover. The colt was heavy in her hand, familiar as breathing. She heard Hope before she saw her, a muffled cry of pain that sent rage flooding through Clara's veins. Moving carefully through the rocks, she could make out 4 figures in the clearing at the base of the ridge. Hope was on her knees, hands bound, a man standing behind her with a gun to her head. 2 others flanked them, rifles ready. The 4th figure stepped forward into the moonlight, and Clara's breath caught. She knew that face, though she'd never seen it before. The resemblance to Victor Hale was uncanny, the same sharp features, the same cruel mouth. But younger, perhaps 30, with an intensity that Victor had never possessed. Mrs. Carver, he called out. I know you're there. Your reputation precedes you. You wouldn't have come without scouting first. Please join us. Your daughter is anxious to see you. Clara emerged from the shadows, the Colt visible but not raised. Another Hale bastard. The man smiled. Legitimate, actually. Victor's son from his first marriage before he came west. Mother died in childbirth, and dear father abandoned me to chase fortune in the territories. I'm William Hale. What do you want? What's mine by birthright? The journal you stole from my father contains more than account numbers. It has locations, gold mines, weapons, caches, lists of men who owe the Hale name loyalty. I'm rebuilding what you destroyed. Your father was a monster. My father was a visionary who understood that power comes from fear. You taught people not to fear. I'm here to remind them why they should. Hope struggled against her bonds, and the man holding her pressed the gun harder against her temple. Clara saw blood trickling down her daughter's face from a cut above her eye. The journal for my daughter, Clara said simply. Of course, though I should mention the journal is only part of what I want. William began walking closer, staying carefully out of her line of fire. I want you to watch as I undo everything you've built. Your schools will burn. Your students will learn what happens to those who resist the natural order, and then only then will I kill you as you killed my father. Your father died because he couldn't accept that people aren't property. You'll die for the same reason. William laughed. Brave words from a woman outnumbered and outgunned. The journal, Mrs. Carver. Now. Clara reached into her coat, slowly pulling out the leather-bound book she'd carried for 25 years as evidence, as reminder, as warning. She held it up in the moonlight. Let hope go first. You're hardly in a position to negotiate. I'm in the only position that matters. I have what you want. And unlike your father, I'm perfectly willing to die rather than submit. She pulled a match from her pocket with her free hand. I'll burn it before I hand it over with my daughter still captive. William's eyes narrowed. You're bluffing. Clara struck the match against a rock, holding it close to the journal. Your father thought I was bluffing too, right up until I put a bullet between his eyes. The standoff stretched taut. Then William nodded to the man holding Hope. Let her go. Hope stumbled forward, and Clara moved to meet her halfway, still keeping the journal visible. As they passed, Clara whispered, Run for the horses. Jonah's coming. But Hope, her mother's daughter, shook her head. Not without you, stubborn child. I learned from the best. They stood together now, mother and daughter facing 3 armed men in the moonlight. Clara handed Hope the journal. When I move, you run. No arguments. The journal, William demanded, growing impatient. Clara smiled the same cold smile she'd given Victor Hale in the moments before his death. There's something you should know about the journal, William. Something your father never wrote down because he was too arrogant to imagine losing. What? I've had 25 years to study it, to memorize every word, every account number, every location. The physical book is worthless. The knowledge lives here. She tapped her temple. Kill me, and it dies with me. Let us go, and I might consider sharing some of it. William's face contorted with rage. You lying! The shot came from behind them, taking one of William's men in the shoulder and spinning him around. Jonah's voice rang out from the ridgeline. Federal marshals, drop your weapons. Everything happened at once. William went for his gun. The man who'd been holding Hope swung his rifle toward Jonah's position. Clara drew the Navy Colt with the speed of muscle memory and desperation. Her first shot took the rifleman's center mass. Her second caught William in the arm as he tried to aim at Hope. The third man, already wounded from Jonah's shot, was trying to retreat when Thomas Hale emerged from the shadows and clubbed him down with a rifle butt. William lay on the ground, clutching his bleeding arm, staring up at Clara with hatred that matched his father's. This isn't over. There are more of us. We'll keep coming. Clara stood over him, the Colt steady in her hand. For a moment, she was 25 years younger, standing over Victor Hale with the same choice: kill the threat or let the law handle it. But she wasn't that desperate girl anymore. She was a teacher, a mother, a builder of futures. Yes, you'll keep coming, she said, and we'll keep standing against you. Every generation will have its Victor Hales and its Clara Whitmores. The only question is which side wins more often. She lowered the gun as Jonah and his deputies arrived to take William into custody. Hope wrapped her arms around her mother, both of them shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. You came for me, Hope whispered. Always come, Clara replied. That's what family does. The ride back to Denver was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. William Hale would stand trial, but Clara knew he was right. There would be others. The cycle of violence and resistance would continue long after she was gone. At home, she found Elizabeth waiting on the porch, her young face grave with worry. "Grandmother Mother said you went to save Aunt Hope. She said you went alone." Clara gathered her granddaughter into her arms. "Not alone. Never really alone. Your grandfather was there and Uncle Thomas. We protect each other." "Were you frightened?" "Terrified. But fear isn't the enemy, dear one. Paralysis is. You can be afraid and still act. That's what courage really is." Later, after the statements had been given and William Hale secured in federal custody, awaiting trial, the family gathered once again. The journal that had caused so much bloodshed sat on the table between them, looking innocuous for something that had shaped so many lives. "We should burn it," Mary suggested. "End this once and for all." "No." Hope disagreed. "It's evidence, history, proof of what happened." "It's a curse," Catherine said quietly. "As long as it exists, people will come for it." Clara picked up the journal, feeling its familiar weight. "It's all of those things. But most of all, it's a reminder of what we survived, what we overcame, what we must always guard against." She stood and walked to the fireplace. For a long moment, she held the journal over the flames, watching them dance and flicker. Then she pulled it back. "Not yet," she decided. "William Hale's trial needs this evidence. But after that," she looked at each of her family members. "After that, we let it burn. Let the past burn with it." The trial of William Hale became a sensation, drawing journalists from across the country. Hope wrote daily dispatches for her newspaper chronicling not just the legal proceedings, but the deeper story of how the West was changing, how the old ways of might makes right were slowly giving way to law and order. Clara testified from 3 days, recounting the night she'd fled Victor Hale, the siege, at the mission, the years of threats and violence that had followed. When the prosecutor asked her if she regretted killing Victor Hale, she answered without hesitation. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the law failed to protect me and countless others from his evil. But I don't regret defending myself and my freedom." William Hale was convicted on all counts, kidnapping, attempted murder, conspiracy. As they led him away, he caught Clara's eye and mouthed a single word: "Soon." She understood. Soon there would be another threat, another face of evil demanding submission. But she also understood something William didn't, that each victory made the next one easier, that each generation of fighters made the next generation stronger. A month after the trial, they held a ceremony in the schoolyard. The whole town turns out to watch, as Clara placed Victor Hale's journal into a metal box along with other documents from that era, wanted posters, trial transcripts, photographs of those who'd fought and died. "We're not destroying history," she told the assembled crowd. "We're transforming it. This box will be sealed and placed in the courthouse cornerstone to be opened in 50 years. Let future generations read these documents with the distance of time. Let them judge us and our actions, but let them also understand that we fought for the right to live free." Samuel, in his judge's robe, supervised the sealing of the box. Mary's students sang a hymn about redemption. Hope took photographs for posterity. And Elizabeth, representing the next generation, helped her grandmother place the box into its stone housing. As the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Thomas Hale approached Clara. He'd aged in the months since William's capture, his hair now more gray than brown, but there was a peace in his eyes she'd never seen before. "It's finished," he said. "The Hale line ends with William in prison and me unmarried. The curse dies with us." "No," Clara said gently. "The name might end, but you've proven that blood doesn't determine destiny. You chose differently. That's not an ending, it's a transformation. You always were too optimistic for someone who's killed as many men as you have." Clara laughed, surprising herself. "Perhaps, but optimism is its own form of resistance. Believing things can be better, working to make them better. That's the ultimate rebellion against men like Victor and William." That evening, Clara returned to the schoolhouse alone. She stood in the empty classroom, looking at the rows of desks, the chalkboard covered with tomorrow's lessons, the map of America that now showed states where territories had been. She thought of the girl who'd run barefoot through the desert, blood on her white dress, terror in her heart. That girl couldn't have imagined this moment standing in her own school, having raised children who were changing the world, having built something lasting from the ashes of violence. The Navy Colt was back in her desk drawer, cleaned and loaded as always. But beside it now sat other things, letters from former students, photographs of graduations, a pressed flower from her wedding to Jonah, weapons and memories side by side. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Jonah stood in the doorway, his marshal's badge catching the last light of day. "Ready to go home?" he asked. "In a moment. I'm just remembering." He came to stand beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "Good memories or bad?" "Both, all. They're inseparable now, aren't they? The violence and the peace, the fear and the courage. That's life in the territories. Hell, that's life anywhere worth living." They stood together in comfortable silence, two warriors grown old, but not soft-scarred, but not broken. Through the window, they could see the town lighting lamps against the gathering darkness, families settling in for evening meals, children playing in the last minutes before bed. "Do you think it's over?" Clara asked. "Really over. The specific threat, maybe. The general fight, never. There will always be those who want to own others, control others, break others, and there will always need to be people willing to stand against them. Then we've taught them well. The next generation." Jonah turned her to face him, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders. "Clara, you've taught hundreds of children not just to read and write, but to think and question and stand. You've shown them that courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. If that's not preparing them, nothing could." A week later, an unexpected visitor arrived at the school. Clara was teaching geography when Ben Cooper escorted in a well-dressed woman in her 60s, her bearing regal despite her travel-worn appearance. "Mrs. Carver, I'm Helen Morrison, formerly Helen Whitmore, your father's sister." Clara hadn't seen her aunt since before her mother's death, nearly 30 years ago. The family had fractured when Helen married an Eastern banker and moved to Boston, cutting ties with her gambler brother and his struggling family. "Aunt Helen," Clara's voice was carefully neutral. "This is unexpected. Might we speak privately?" Clara dismissed her class early, watching as the children filed out with curious backward glances. When they were alone, Helen studied her niece with eyes that were unmistakably Whitmore, the same green as Clara's own. "I read about the trial in the Boston papers, about everything you've endured and accomplished." Helen paused, seeming to struggle with words. "I've come to apologize. When Samuel lost himself to gambling and drink, I should have helped, should have taken you in, given you options besides." She gestured vaguely, encompassing the years of violence and struggle. "I didn't need saving," Clara said quietly. "I needed to save myself. And I did. Yes, I can see that. You've become remarkable. Your mother would be so proud. She might also have been alive if you'd helped when Father's debts first spiraled out of control." Helen flinched. "You're right. I carry that guilt. I've carried it for decades, which is why I'm here now." She pulled out a leather portfolio. "I'm dying. Cancer, the doctors say. 6 months, perhaps less. I have no children, and my husband passed 5 years ago. I'm leaving everything to you." Clara looked at the documents without touching them. "I don't want your money. It's not about want. It's about what you can do with it. $300,000 properly invested. Enough to build schools across the territory. Enough to ensure no girl ever has to choose between marriage to a monster and destitution. Blood money, guilt money. Yes," Helen agreed simply, "but money that can do good nonetheless. I failed you once. Let me help you now, even if it's too late for forgiveness." Clara was quiet for a long moment, thinking of all the students she could help, all the schools she could build. Pride was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. "I'll take it," she said finally, "not for you or me, but for them, for the next generation of girls who need options." Helen nodded, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Thank you. And Clara, I followed the stories over the years. Every time you stood against those men, every victory you won, I was proud. Proud and ashamed in equal measure. After Helen left, Clara sat alone in the empty schoolhouse, overwhelmed by the strange turns life could take. From penniless runaway to wealthy educator, from desperate victim to powerful protector. The money would change everything she could build, the network of schools she'd always dreamed of. Create scholarships for the poorest students, ensure that education truly became the equalizer she'd always believed it could be. That evening, she shared the news with her family. There was initial resistance, Mary worried about accepting tainted money. Samuel concerned about legal implications, Hope curious about Helen's motives, but Jonah, practical as always, cut through the debate. Money has no memory, he said. It's not good or evil in itself. It's what we do with it that matters. And I can't think of anyone better qualified to transform wealth into wisdom than Clara. Plans began immediately. Clara worked with Samuel on establishing a legal foundation, the Whitmore Educational Trust, that would outlive them all. Mary designed curricula that balanced practical skills with critical thinking. Hope began writing articles about the democratization of education in the American West. Even Thomas Hale contributed, using his connections to identify communities most in need of schools. But late at night, when the planning was done and the house was quiet, Clara found herself returning to that first terrifying night 25 years ago. She'd run with nothing but fear and desperation. Now she had everything: family, respect, wealth, purpose. Yet the woman she was now had been forged in that crucible of violence and choice. Elizabeth found her one such night, sitting on the porch despite the cold, the Navy Colt disassembled on the table before her, cleaning it with the methodical care of long practice. "Grandmother, why do you still keep that gun?" Clara's hands never paused in their work. "Sit down, child. It's time you heard the whole truth." She told Elizabeth everything, not the sanitized version she shared with students, but the raw, bloody reality. The feel of Victor Hale's hands on her throat, the smell of gunpowder in the mission, the weight of William's gun against Hope's temple, the terrible clarity that came with killing to survive. "That gun," she said, reassembling the Colt with practiced ease, "is a reminder that civilization is thin, that evil is real, that sometimes violence is the only answer to violence. I pray you never need such a reminder, but if you do, you'll know how to use it." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, digesting this harder truth. Then she asked, "Do you think I'll have to fight like you did?" "I hope not. Every generation we push the darkness back a little further. We build walls of law and education and community, but walls can fall, laws can be corrupted, communities can turn. So yes, you might have to fight, just perhaps not with guns." "Then with what?" "With whatever tools your time demands. Words, votes, organization, resistance. The weapons change, but the war remains the same, those who would control versus those who would be free." A month later, they broke ground on the first Whitmore school in a mining town 40 miles from Denver. Clara turned the first shovelful of earth while a crowd of miners' children watched with eager eyes. These were the forgotten ones, the ones whose parents could barely afford food, let alone education. But now they would have a chance. As she spoke at the ceremony, Clara noticed a group of well-dressed men standing apart from the crowd, watching with disapproving eyes. She recognized the type: landowners, mine operators, the ones who profited from ignorance and desperation. They saw education as a threat to their power, and they were right. After the ceremony, one of them approached a Mr. Carlyle, who owned 3 of the largest mines in the region. "Mrs. Carver," he said with false politeness, "while we appreciate charity, we worry about filling these children's heads with ideas above their station. Miners' children should learn mining, not poetry and philosophy." Clara smiled the smile that had once preceded violence. Now it preceded something more dangerous: words. "Mr. Carlyle, I've found that the most dangerous thing you can give a person isn't a weapon, but an idea. The idea that they're worth more than their labor, that they have rights beyond what their employers grant, that they can think and choose and change their circumstances. Yes, I'm going to fill their heads with such ideas. And yes, you should be worried." Carlyle's face reddened. "You can't threaten the natural order without consequences." "I've been threatened by better men than you," Clara replied calmly. "They're all dead or in prison now. Would you like to test whether my aim with words has deteriorated as much as my aim with bullets?" He retreated. But Clara knew this was just the beginning of a new kind of battle.
As schools rose across the territory, 5 in the first year, 12 by the second, so did opposition. Mysterious fires threatened teachers' attempted legislation to limit inappropriate education. But Clara had spent 25 years building a network of fighters. Former students who'd become lawyers fought the legislation. Jonah's marshals investigated the fires. Hope's articles in national newspapers brought scrutiny that made overt violence too risky. Still, the threat remained. One evening, as Clara was leaving the Denver school, she noticed a familiar figure waiting by her carriage, the unnamed man who'd visited after Margaret Thornton's death, one of Victor's unnamed protégés. "Mrs. Carver," he said, touching his hat. "I told you some of us would adapt to your new world. I've come to make you an offer." Clara's hand drifted to her coat pocket, where a smaller pistol, now rested age, had made the Navy Colt too heavy for constant carry. "I'm listening." "Your schools are threatening certain interests, powerful men who prefer their workers ignorant and compliant. They've pooled resources to stop you legally, if possible, illegally if necessary. And you're warning me out of the goodness of your heart." He smiled. "Hardly. I'm a businessman now, Mrs. Carver. I've learned that education creates more profitable workers. They innovate, they solve problems, they create value. Your schools are good for my investments, so I propose an alliance of sorts. I don't ally with Victor Hale's disciples. No, but you might accept intelligence from someone who still moves in those circles. Names, plans, weaknesses, information that could help you protect your teachers and students." Clara studied him for a long moment. "And in return, nothing. Consider it an investment in the future I'm betting on. Though if you wanted to mention to your federal judge's son that I've been helpful, I wouldn't object." It was a devil's bargain accepting help from one of Victor's trained monsters. But Clara had learned that purity was a luxury she couldn't afford when children's lives and futures were at stake. "Intelligence only," she said firmly. "No violence on my behalf, no crimes committed in my name. And if you betray me, I'll kill you myself." "Understood. The first thing you should know, they're planning to kidnap one of your teachers. Make an example of her. Sarah Martinez at the Copper Creek School." Clara was moving before he finished speaking, heading not home, but to Jonah's office. Within hours, Sarah Martinez had federal protection, and 3 men were in custody for conspiracy. The unnamed man's intelligence had been accurate. Over the months that followed, he continued to provide information, always accurate, always actionable. Clara never trusted him, never even learned his name, but she used what he offered to protect her growing network of schools. By the 3rd year of the Whitmore Educational Trust, 37 schools operated across 3 states. Thousands of children who would have grown up illiterate were learning to read, write, think. The transformation was remarkable and remarkably threatening to those who'd profited from ignorance.